Subcommittee on Energy, Climate, and Grid Security will now come to order, and the chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Before we do that, just want to take a minute in today's hearing and pause for the nearly 3,000 Americans who lost their lives on this tragic day 23 years ago. Our thoughts and prayers are with the survivors and families who lost their loved ones. We'll never forget their brave sacrifice. And if we could, just a brief moment of silence. Thank you for that. Never forget. We welcome you to today's hearing. From gas to groceries, Americans pay the price of the Biden and Harris energy agenda. Today, we're going to review the past 4 years to examine how record high energy prices have impacted American families and their pursuit of the American dream. Since the beginning of this Congress, members of this subcommittee have attended numerous hearings and roundtables focused on the issues that impacted our everyday lives. Since day one, the Biden-Harris administration has waged a war on American energy, and the results have been devastating. The facts are undeniable. Inflation has surged out of control, price levels remain unacceptably high, and it all began with energy. Energy is foundational. Records have been set with historically high prices for gasoline, diesel, fertilizers, and many fossil fuel-based commodities. Supply chain shortages have rippled across the economy, affecting everything from computer chips to toilet paper. Americans are paying more for groceries, for their housing. They're paying high credit card bills, higher than when the administration took over. Massive government spending and tax subsidies have distorted energy markets and have destabilized our electric grid. And government spending is a huge driver of inflation. Who pays the price for all this? Every American, rich and poor, the upper class, the middle class, the lower class. They're paying more and getting less under the Biden-Harris agenda. Americans are suffering under the administration's energy policies. Energy powers our economy. The cost of energy, fossil fuels, and electricity is embedded in everything that we buy. From gas to groceries, everything costs a lot more than it did just 4 years ago. Now, my Democrat colleagues may not want to admit it, but American families are feeling the pain. Inflation, grocery bills, housing costs. These are real issues that people are talking about around their kitchen tables. These are issues that the people care about. Today's hearing will give members an opportunity to hear the stories of Americans on the front line of the Biden-Harris administration's American energy war. We will learn about and how the American dream is being threatened by energy and economic policies that prioritize a global climate agenda over American families, their standard of living, and quality of life. We'll hear how federal regulations targeting fossil fuel production and electric generation are resulting in record-shattering electricity bills and forced power outages. We'll also learn why our groceries cost so much more now than they did just 4 years ago. We'll examine the false promises of a green transition and why claims of price gouging are another distraction from the administration's failed policy agenda. Prices are high because of the built-in cost of energy and commodities. These trends are directly related to the policies of this administration. Now, we're going to hear from the other side of the aisle that oil and gas production is at record highs. And honestly, that's great, because global demand for energy is only increasing. But the Biden-Harris administration had nothing to do with that. Most of these increases have come on state and private land, and oil and gas projects don't pop up the ground overnight, and they don't pop up the ground in 4 years. From the time of a discovery to exploration, to development of a well, to bringing that production online takes years and years. And the production increases we're seeing now are based on the policies of past administrations, not this one that started day one, targeting the American fossil fuel and energy sector. We can talk about cancellation of offshore leases and leases on federal lands. Fewer lease sales on the OCS by this administration and its 5-year plan than we've ever seen. They've had a war on energy, wanting to stop LNG exports with their pause, We've discussed a lot of this. And taking credit for increased production today is like the rooster taking credit for the sunrise. It happened because of something else, not this administration's policy. This administration's only tried to thwart oil and gas production, a process that takes multiple years. Today's hearing highlights this subcommittee's work in this Congress. We've held dozens of hearings and with expert witnesses and administration officials. We've explored the issues sector by sector across jurisdiction, and a consistent lesson has emerged: increasing the supply of energy and reducing regulatory roadblocks to ease the cost of delivering energy produces a powerful driver for the economy and lowers prices. Republicans have worked on this. We've also passed important legislation like H.R. 1, Lower Energy Cost Act, to reform the energy permitting process and reverse these harmful regulations that threaten our economic growth here in America. We still have important work to do, and I hope to use the remainder of this Congress to push these important reforms over the finish line. With that, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I'll yield back and recognize the ranking member, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I was just fascinated to hear your opening statement, because for this whole Congress, we've been hearing you and your colleagues talking about how oil prices and production are so high in this country, but apparently you found out the same thing we did, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, that oil production is up and prices are actually down. And so now it's not because of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I guess it's because of the previous administration. So, talk about shifting the goalposts all the time. What we need is a strong energy policy, and I'm going to talk about that. Something else I want to talk about, Mr. Chairman, is I want to bring a little dose of reality to what you were saying about inflation, because for the past 2 years, we've been hearing you and all your colleagues talk about inflation is out of control and high. So today, the Consumer Price Index report just came out a few minutes ago. That's a report that measures inflation, and it was just released this morning. For example, inflation with groceries, food at home, finally has stabilized to zero. Food costs are still too high. I'm not going to deny that. But the fact is, inflation with food is going down, and we need to continue that trend. For energy, it was even better. Inflation for all energy was negative 0.08 or 0.8% in August. Energy prices actually went down. That's great for the American family. It's not great enough yet, but it's the right trajectory, and we need to keep on going with this team. I want to talk about what happened 4 years ago when we were facing a pandemic and the devastated supply chains and the economies that were shut down. Shortly after the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine began, further exacerbating supply chains and driving prices higher. Since then, the Biden-Harris administration has worked, and apparently it's starting to work, to lower energy costs for everyday Americans. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, America currently produces more crude oil and natural gas than any country in history. But while we are seeing record production domestically, gas prices remain too high as big oil and gas companies return record profits and pay massive stock payoffs. We had a hearing in this subcommittee, in the O&I subcommittee in 2022 when I was the chair of that subcommittee, and I had 6 oil and gas executives come in to talk about why their companies were earning so much profit as the Americans struggled to pay at the pump. They said it was because their shareholders demanded that they get as high a price as they could, and low it came to be. So it didn't have anything to do with low gas production or any of the other things that my colleagues are saying today. So I guess it's campaign season, so we're going to be having this hearing, and we're going to hear from some witnesses who will hopefully shed light on how corporations are earning more than ever while Americans are still paying higher prices, and the steps that the Biden-Harris administration has done to strengthen the energy supply chains, which is what's going to bring down prices. In March 2023, the House passed H.R. 1 also known as the Polluters Over People Act, the majority's #1 legislative priority. This bill was a giveaway to the companies profiting most off the energy prices that the bill claimed to combat. 17 months later, the majority still hadn't sent that bill from the desk over to the Senate because they know it's a failed policy. Also, we spent legislative time on a lot of anti-efficiency bills, like, for real, this is the name, Refrigerator Freedom Act. It's not just a silly title. Independent estimates have found that conservation measures Republicans are seeking to repeal put billions of dollars into the pockets of consumers. And finally, one thing I want to talk about is how the administration has tackled the long-term problem by focusing on energy supply chains at home rather than outsourcing our energy demands. I've got a chart, because why not? And what the chart shows is that the U.S. has produced record crude oil this past year. Not only did we surpass Saudi Arabia and Russia, the U.S. is producing more crude oil than any country ever. This increase is helping to secure the energy and economic security. In other words, President Biden and Vice President Harris are unleashing American energy. And this progress is the direct result of policy choices from this administration. Now, if you look at, you can see this. In the last administration, this is the record, but now it's going up even more because of these policies. So as I said at the beginning of my remarks, I guess it's the silly season, but at least on this side of the aisle, we want to talk about facts, and we want to talk about how energy prices can be brought down even further for the American public. I yield back.
Generally yields back. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Duncan. Before we begin, today we remember all those who lost and the heroes who bravely confronted evil on 9/11. We can never forget them or their sacrifices, so we remember what's at stake, our values, our country, and our children's future. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. We look forward to your testimony. Affordable, reliable energy is foundational to everything that we do. It's key for our national security and for the prosperity of American families, businesses, and communities. From the manufacture and production of everyday goods we need to take care of our families, to the power necessary to keep homes warm in the winter and cool in the summer, it starts with energy. Over the past 2 years, the Energy and Commerce Committee has led the way to expose how the Biden-Harris administration's war on American energy is fueling the out-of-control inflation that is hurting our financial security and the financial security of the American people. We have examined how the administration's radical rush to green agenda and regulations are threatening our national security and our economic growth by restricting energy expansion, by shutting down reliable baseload power generation and replacing it with unreliable, expensive generation, and by driving up the cost of mobility and home ownership, putting the American dream out of reach for many. We've also examined how the radical Biden-Harris EPA has set new emission standards at levels that will make it nearly impossible to permit the expansion or building of new manufacturing in most of the country, crushing good-paying jobs and further driving up the cost of our goods. This administration's war on American energy impacts every aspect of our lives, and hardworking Americans are facing the consequences every day, from the gas pump to the grocery store. Today, American families pay on average 30% more for electricity, 25% more for gas to heat their homes, 56% more for gasoline to fuel their cars, as they did in January of 2021. Right now, families are paying the largest portion of their income on food in 30 years. I recently read about a mom living in North Carolina who said, quote, "Sometimes I have to choose whether I'm going to pay the light bill or do I pay all the rent or buy food or not let my son do a sport." It doesn't have to be this way, and it shouldn't be this way. In my home state of Washington, the average family is paying over $1,000 more per month, $1,066 in fact, on average than they did in January 2021 for the same goods and services, and that's according to the Joint Economic Committee. That adds up to more than $300,000 in additional spending due to inflation since the start of the Biden-Harris administration. In California, it's even worse. On average, households have spent $35,000 more since this administration took over. And in spite of all of this, the Biden-Harris administration has doubled down on its radical policies. Today, we will focus on how the administration's rush to green energy policies contribute to the high cost Americans face every day across the board and the resulting consequences on families and businesses. Without taking action to promote American energy expansion, there is tremendous uncertainty for our future. While the United States has regained its leadership in oil and gas production, thanks to the pro-American energy policies of the previous administration, current restrictions led by the Biden-Harris administration on future energy production jeopardizes this success. The administration's increased taxes, increased regulations, limits on drilling puts us on a path not to be able to meet America's growing needs. Check the facts. There's an important choice we need to make moving forward. We can continue down the path of energy restrictions, reduced reliability, and unaffordable costs, or we can choose the path of energy dominance, security, and economic prosperity. I believe the choice is obvious. We must focus on advancing policies that reduce costs for American families and businesses, and that begins with unleashing American energy production to lower cost, make life more affordable, and reject the Biden-Harris administration's rush to green agenda. Let's stand up for American values, the values of free market competition, the values of innovation, the values of environmental stewardship. Those are our values, and that's how we win the future. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is missing the point. If committee Republicans were really concerned about energy prices, they would have immediately scheduled a hearing into the Federal Trade Commission's allegations that a former big oil CEO had colluded with OPEC to limit crude oil production and increase prices on hardworking families. This is a massive scandal, and it alarms me so much that I opened an investigation as soon as I heard the news. Unfortunately, committee Republicans have done nothing about this. In May, I requested that Chair Rogers hold a hearing on these allegations, and it's been over 3 months now, and no action from the Republican majority. So yesterday, I wrote the chair again, asking that the majority merely schedule a briefing with the FTC so that we can learn more about what the agency has uncovered. And I can't call for the hearing on my own. The request must come from the chair of the committee. A serious crime has allegedly been committed against the American people by which big oil colluded with our adversaries to increase prices at the pump, and committee Republicans have buried their heads in the sand. This is a perfect example of what 4 more years of Trump and Republicans' polluters over people agenda would get us. And we know exactly what 4 more years of Trump would look like because it's included in the Trump Project 2025, an extreme playbook that would consolidate power in the White House, gut checks and balances, and eliminate the independence of our federal agencies. It's an extreme agenda to take control of Americans' lives and freedoms. The energy and climate policies included in Trump's Project 2025 are extraordinarily clear. Republicans want to repeal programs that lower energy costs for Americans and instead ramp up activities that favor polluting fossil fuels and increase prices on hardworking American families. It would eliminate energy efficiency standards that save Americans money and the independence of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It also calls for dramatically increasing coal burning and natural gas exports, something that is good for polluters but increases energy prices on American families. And if you look at the Republicans' actual record, you can see Trump's Project 2025 all over the place. In fact, 2 of the Republican witnesses today represent organizations that helped author Project 2025. Throughout this Congress, Republicans have targeted energy-saving programs at every turn, and now they have the audacity to accuse the Biden administration and Democrats of high energy prices. They've wasted time passing ridiculous bills like Refrigerator Freedom Act that would make appliances more expensive to operate. Virtually all the energy bills Republicans have prioritized this Congress echo the extreme policies outlined in Project 2025. And this all stands in stark contrast to the substantial victories that the Biden-Harris administration and congressional Democrats have achieved over the last 4 years. President Biden was able to use the nation's strategic petroleum reserve to lower gas prices when they spiked in 2022 after Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The Biden-Harris administration sold oil when prices were high and bought it back when prices were low, making a profit of nearly $1 billion for the American taxpayer. Meanwhile, gas prices are down $1.60 below their highs 2 years ago. That's a win-win for the American people. And thanks to the Biden-Harris administration and congressional Democrats, the average household is poised to save up to $220 a year on electricity costs over the next decade. The bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act included a variety of programs and tax credits designed to help Americans lower energy consumption and reduce energy bills. The key goals of these laws were to lower costs for American families, create good-paying jobs, and combat the worsening climate crisis, and that's exactly what they're doing. Now, this hearing is about contrasting agendas. Trump's Project 2025 will increase energy prices, make power less reliable, and make our air and water dirtier. It's a playbook to ensure that Americans are dragged back to the 19th century rather than advancing forward into the 21st century. Democrats' energy priorities will ensure that every American has access to affordable, reliable, and clean energy. Republican energy policies, by contrast, double down on expensive and volatile fossil fuels, raising energy bills on families across the country in the process. And we can't allow that to happen. We just cannot go back. That's the bottom line. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and that'll conclude the members' opening statements. The Chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and taking time to testify before this subcommittee. Each witness will be given the opportunity to give an opening statement, 5 minutes, and then we'll have a round of questioning by the members. Some lights in front of you. Green means go. Yellow means you're about to your end. When it gets to red, you need to wrap up. I don't want to raise the gavel. And so if you can adhere to that, we can try to move on time. But again, thank you. Introduce the witnesses, Ms. Patricia Onwuka, and she's director of the Center for Economic Opportunity with the Independent Women's Forum. Ms. Linda Pryor, she's a farm manager of Hilltop Farm from Hendersonville, North Carolina. Some of the best apples in the world are grown in Hendersonville. Thanks for being here. She's on behalf of the American Farm Bureau Federation. Senior Vice President Trevor Higgins, Senior Vice President for Energy and Environment at the Center for American Progress, and Mr. Travis Fisher, Director of Energy and Environmental Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. So we appreciate you all for being here, and I'll now recognize Ms. Onwuka for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Chair Duncan and Chair Rogers, who just left. Thank you, Ranking Members Pallone and Daggett, and the committee for having me to testify today. My name is Patrice Onwuka, and I'm the director of the Center for Economic Opportunity at Independent Women's Forum. We're a nonprofit organization that is committed to increasing the number of women who value free markets and personal liberty. Many households are straining under the weight of high prices and rising costs for energy that cut down their disposable income and force some to make some disheartening choices. This hearing offers a timely opportunity to explore the impacts of the Biden-Harris energy agenda on American households. Now, we know inflation rates are down from June 2021 highs. However, overall prices are up 19.4% over the past 3.5 years of the Biden-Harris administration. Home heating oil is up 36%, electricity is up 32%, and natural gas up 25%. And these prices started to rise in early 2021. Americans spend on average of $429 per month, or about $5,100 per year on utilities. But this is just part of the story. Housing costs have accelerated and are the biggest drivers of inflation right now. The monthly costs for a median-priced home are at the highest in more than 30 years. We know the Federal Reserve is fighting inflation by raising its benchmark federal funds rate to a 22-year high, but that makes credit cards and mortgages all cost more each month. So American households are in a more tenuous financial position now than they were before inflation took off in early 2021. Average households have lost roughly $2,000 of purchasing power. Personal savings have fallen by nearly $3 trillion, and collective credit card balances are at an all-time high. Interestingly, though, and dishearteningly, some demographics are uniquely more negatively impacted by high energy costs than others. Poor and working-class families spend proportionately more of their incomes on essential items such as food and energy than higher-income households. Yet these households are least likely to meet their basic heating, cooling, and energy needs. 44% of households living near or below the federal poverty line experience these challenges. They contend with heating and electrical problems, utility service interruptions, inadequate insulation, and this diminishes their quality of life, placing them in unhealthy and sometimes dangerous situations. Lower-income Black households experience the highest rates of energy challenges compared to Hispanic, white, and Asian households. Regionally, we also see low-income people in Southeast states also disproportionately likely to face energy hardships. And unfortunately, lower-income families in America face a heat or eat dilemma, this existential choice between paying utilities or buying food, medicine, and shelter. When we look at the shares of Black and Hispanic households who have reduced food and medicine in order to pay their energy bills, we're seeing those rates 2.5 to 3 times higher than white counterparts. So how did we get to a place where a working mom is choosing between energy bills and food or rent, as the ranking Chair Rogers mentioned? Well, inflation and high prices are the consequences of unsustainable federal spending and burdensome regulations on energy. Economists on the left and the right agree that the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan fueled inflation by injecting the economy with stimulus funding to spur spending when supply could not keep up. The Biden-Harris climate agenda has focused on undermining domestic energy production, causing energy costs to rise. Everything grown, manufactured, produced, packaged, and transported depends on energy. And as energy prices rise, consumers are paying more. We've seen the administration cancel pipelines, take hundreds of thousands of acres offline for drilling, institute restrictive new environmental standards that raise the cost of drilling. And interestingly, there's this new carbon-reducing regulatory agenda that forces households to switch to costly appliances. Americans are paying 34% now more for appliances compared to 15 years ago. But by targeting 15 consumer appliances, everything from stoves to refrigerators, air conditioners, ceiling fans, dishwashers, Americans are left with fewer options, and the upfront cost of installing these new appliances would be cost prohibitive to too many households who would forego any purported energy savings. Really? How can policymakers demand that an average household pay an additional $9,000 to retrofit their home with these alternative appliances when they're barely treading water and are choosing between food and heating their home? We need to restore the American middle class to prosperity, bring prices down, and that starts with economic growth that leads to sustained real wage growth, not just nominal, and also policy reforms that rein in fiscal spending and burdensome regulations, especially on energy. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I'll now recognize Ms. Pryor, whose farm area is right above my district, just across the North Carolina line. So, Ms. Pryor, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Duncan, Rogers, Ranking Members DeGette and Pallone, members of the committee, thank you for having me. My name is Linda Pryor. I'm a third-generation farmer in western North Carolina. We primarily grow apples and corn, along with hay and beef cattle. In addition to being a farmer, I'm a wife, mother, and the primary grocery shopper for my family. As the USDA numbers released last week show, this will be the second consecutive year of negative growth for farmers and ranchers. The agricultural sector is facing unprecedented challenges due to rising costs to operate, particularly increased petroleum prices. These costs impact more than what we pay at the gas pump. They also increase the cost of crop inputs like seed and fertilizer, farm machinery parts, produce packaging, and other essentials. Farmers are experiencing financial hits from both ends of the production process. Our input costs are significantly higher than they were just a couple of years ago. Even when adjusting for inflation, farm expenses are up 9.5% going back to 2019. But the price that our buyers are willing to pay for the food that we grow has not kept pace with our production cost increases. One of the primary drivers of the increased cost is energy. Expensive energy makes everything else consumers want and need more expensive. We need affordable and reliable long-term energy solutions for farmers to ensure that grocery shelves remain stocked with affordable options for American families. The cost to run my family's farm has surged over the last few years. The fuel cost increase to operate our equipment and trucks has created a noticeable hardship for my farm since 2021, when we spent $57,000 for diesel and gasoline compared to what we spent last year, which was $83,600 for the same amount of diesel and gasoline. Fuel prices have increased nationally by close to 30% since 2021, while the sale price for my corn and apples has actually decreased since 2021. This disparity threatens the economic sustainability of American farms. According to USDA, 70% of agricultural products are dependent on trucking, but on my farm, 100% are dependent on trucking, both to receive the materials that we need to operate and to move our crops off the farm. Trucking fresh produce requires dependable, on-demand energy to operate. Once apples are harvested, they must be moved quickly to avoid deterioration, and the apples that I grow go to multiple outlets. The over 5 million pounds of apples that we grow travel an average of 775 miles to their first destination. During harvest season, we operate up to 3 tractor trailers ourselves and truck the 150,000 bushels of corn that we grow. Those trucks will leave our farm around 5 a.m., travel 208 miles round trip to the mill in Newberry, South Carolina, then return to move the corn out of the field as it is harvested, transport it to our bins for storage, and reload for the next morning to do it all again. These trucks average 14-hour workdays and a minimum of 250 miles per day. Using diesel allows us to keep moving throughout those long days, rather than having to figure out how and when to charge an electric truck. The rural nature of farming means that we rarely have access to a location where electric trucks or equipment could be charged, and tractors and equipment often stay in a field or orchard for several days at a time. Additionally, when farmers make large equipment purchases, they intend to operate this machinery for many years, and many need to be able to maintain the equipment themselves. The idea of having to purchase new equipment that would be too complex to maintain on the farm is out of the question for many farmers. Solar presents its own challenges, one of them being farmland loss. With less farmland, we must be creative to ensure that we keep up with the task of feeding America. Less productive agricultural land drives the value of the remaining land up even further, which can be a barrier to getting into agriculture for young farmers looking to start their own farms. And the increased value also impacts farms that are competing for leased land. Addressing trade imbalances by supporting domestic production and processing could help American farmers compete with less expensive imports. Policies that incentivize the consumption of domestically grown and processed products would strengthen local economies, decrease the overall impact on the environment, and reduce reliance on the energy-intensive imports that I compete against from Chile, Turkey, and China. On my farm, we do many things that take more time and incur more expense to ensure we are responsible stewards of the land and minimize our carbon footprint, like planting cover crops, rotational grazing, using no-till methods, and minimizing grain handling as much as possible. Annually, our orchards alone sequester up to 2,500 tons of carbon dioxide, release about 2,000 tons of oxygen into the atmosphere, and have significant cooling effects. Farmers need affordable and reliable energy solutions. The rising cost of energy and other inputs ripple through the entire food chain, from the farm fields to the grocery store shelves. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Higgins for 5 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Trevor Higgins with the Center for American Progress. Thank you, Chair Duncan and Ranking Member DeGette, for this opportunity to provide testimony on clean and affordable energy investments, about 2 years now after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. Since this groundbreaking legislation became law in August of 2022, overall inflation has slowed by 2/3. And the new numbers this morning, I can't even keep up with them in my testimony, they're even better. As of this morning, annual CPI is at 2.5%, which is the lowest in 3 years. Grocery price inflation, in particular, it's slowed by 9/10. That's now 100%. Energy price inflation is not only slowed, but fully reversed and dropped 7 or 8%. Meanwhile, wages have risen by more than 8%, far outpacing inflation. This is an exceptionally strong record. The Inflation Reduction Act is truly living up to its name. Today, I'd like to highlight a few of the ways the law's strategic investments are driving economic growth, creating new opportunities for the middle class, and lowering energy costs. I'll also highlight the severe consequences of potential repeal. First, in the last 2 years, according to the Clean Investment Monitor that's maintained by the Rhodium Group and MIT, total U.S. investment in domestic clean energy manufacturing has quadrupled. These investments are preparing the U.S. to remain competitive in the clean energy economy. And that's not only good for economic growth and competitiveness. Clean energy investments are a key strategy in the fight against inflation. They shield the economy from the price volatility of fossil fuels. As a recent report from Energy Innovation has documented, states that are investing in clean electricity have seen less increase in electricity prices than the states who've remained most dependent on natural gas. Take Texas, for example, where wind and solar have saved $11 billion in wholesale electricity costs in 2022 alone. Clean electricity has become the most affordable source of energy there is, and these investments are getting it built. Second, new investment programs are directly supporting families and communities who want to make the switch to electricity and improve energy efficiency. For example, federal tax credits and rebates are now available for people who purchase an electric vehicle, which then goes on to save families, since it costs less than half as much to maintain or drive an EV as a gasoline-powered car. There are new rebates for people who install efficient home heat pumps, which can save typical families anywhere between $60 and $840 every year, depending on the type of fuel they were using before. Grants, loans, green banks, direct pay tax credits, they're making it possible for local libraries to add rooftop solar, for small businesses to fix up energy efficiency of their storefronts, for school districts to buy pollution-free school buses, for retrofitting affordable housing apartments with updated equipment. This upfront financial support is making it affordable for people from all walks of life to participate in the clean energy future if they choose to. And even households who are not ready to make the switch to electricity, they can still see major savings from the economy-wide transition to clean energy. Under current policy, demand for fossil fuels could decline in the United States by as much as 16% for petroleum and 20% for natural gas over the coming decade. When demand falls, prices fall, and that benefits everyone, as long as it's not counteracted by exporting the gas overseas. The overall effect of these policies is to shift the economy toward clean and affordable energy. Under current policy, household energy costs are on course to drop by a third in 2035. That's an annual savings of roughly $2,000 per household. Turns out that clean air pollution standards, energy efficiency appliance regulations, clean energy investments are unmistakably strong tools in the fight against inflation. Unfortunately, there are plans and ongoing efforts to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. Project 2025's plans would cause 750,000 direct job losses in 2030 if implemented. These plans would raise electricity prices, prolong dependence on gasoline, and reverse the trajectory towards lower energy costs that I referenced. Instead, we would see increased annual household energy spending above even the pre-IRA numbers. Worse, it would lock the United States into continued greenhouse gas emissions of more than 4.5 gigatons forever. Among the many consequences of climate change, given the topic of this hearing, the one I want to point out is that climate change also raises costs. Already at current levels of warming, insurance premiums are up by a third between 2020 and 2023. Extreme weather is a major determinant of food prices, and extreme heat is costing $1 billion in extra health care costs every summer. I'm grateful to the members of the 117th Congress whose leadership in enacting the Inflation Reduction Act has so successfully channeled our country's limitless industry into raising wages, lowering prices, and fighting climate change. Thank you.
Thank you for testimony. Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize Mr. Fisher for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm Travis Fisher. I'm the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Cato is a nonpartisan public policy research organization in Washington, D.C. that promotes individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and peace. It's an honor to speak with you today about the impact of the Biden-Harris administration's energy policies on the affordability and security of energy for American families and businesses. Unfortunately, bad energy policy has put the United States in a very weak position. American families face rising utility costs and increased strain on household budgets. American businesses, especially the energy-intensive industrial sector, face an uncertain energy future and unnecessary delays. For residential and industrial consumers alike, I am concerned about whether new energy supplies can reliably meet rising demand. And the stakes are high. We have to remember the definition of energy in physics, the ability to do work. Energy policy is too important to get wrong, yet that is precisely what I have witnessed in recent years. As I see it, there are two completely different paths forward regarding energy policy in the United States. The first, which I support, is to embrace American values and foster an energy industry that harnesses entrepreneurship and free market competition to best serve the interests of consumers. This path recognizes the fact that the majority of Americans are unwilling to sacrifice their well-being on behalf of a top-down energy transition. The second, which is the path the Biden-Harris administration has chosen, is to force a transition to politically favored technologies that consumers don't want. Taking the second path puts politics over physics, and I can't support it. Specifically, I want to highlight three major executive branch policies that lie along this path. Each one harms the reliability and affordability of energy in the United States. First is the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. The subsidies in the IRA for wind, solar, and batteries alone could cost American taxpayers $3 trillion by 2050. Those tax credits are not only irresponsible in light of our fiscal situation, but also distort the market signals that bring supply from more reliable energy sources. Second is the regulatory overreach coming from the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, including emissions regulations for vehicle tailpipes and power plants. These rules mandate technologies that Americans don't support. They also violate the major questions doctrine, meaning the EPA doesn't have clear authority from Congress to enact them. Between the IRA subsidies and the EPA rules, I would summarize the administration's power grid policy as this: green the grid and brace for blackouts. Third is the set of arbitrary decisions across many agencies to put the current administration in the role of a central planner for the oil and gas industries. The administration calls this a whole-of-government approach. As one example, earlier this year, the Department of Energy decided on a whim that it would pause approvals to export liquefied natural gas. Another example is using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to score temporary points among voters around election time. Yet another example is the Securities and Exchange Commission attempting to become a climate regulator. As a consequence of this whole-of-government opposition to a wide range of energy resources, Americans have seen the cost of energy rise. This is a significant problem because higher energy costs are regressive and raise the cost of everything. Food, transportation, other basic goods and services require energy as an input. When energy costs rise, those increased costs show up in every part of the economy. The American people want reliable energy at low cost, and policymakers should listen. We need policies that make energy easier to produce, more affordable for American families and businesses. In living rooms across the country, access to low-cost energy can make the difference between light and darkness. It's not too late to stop the coming energy crisis because it's a crisis caused by unwise policies, and we can reform them. Energy can be a bright spot in the American economy if we let it. I urge you to choose the path that will lead to a bright future for America. Thank you.
Jen yields back, and I want to thank you all for your testimony. We'll now move into the question-answer portion of the hearing, and I'll begin questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. From gasoline to groceries, everything's more expensive under the Biden-Harris administration. Republican members of the subcommittee have been sounding the alarm. Record high energy prices, record high housing costs, record high credit card debt. We've explored these issues in depth with individual hearings, and we're going to delve more into it today. So, Ms. Onwuka, persistent inflation and record high energy prices are hurting families and businesses, and it's placing even heavier burden on low-income and rural households. Do you believe that the Biden-Harris administration's policies are to blame?
Thank you for your question. I do. I do believe that the Biden-Harris administration, from the start of their administration, have implemented fiscal and economic policies that have certainly driven, and energy policies that have led inflation to skyrocket to what it was. Let's not forget that the American Rescue Plan Act, passed in 2021, mid-2021, we had economic Obama administration economists like Larry Summers warning that this would touch off generation high inflation. We often hear that inflation was driven by Vladimir Putin invading Russia. That wasn't until 2022. But by mid-2021, inflation was already rising. And let's not forget that at the start of 2021, inflation was just 1.4%, well below the Federal Reserve's 2% rate, target rate. So when you're targeting economic policy, massive fiscal spending that continues, as well as the impact on energy, the policies around energy, that's going to have an impact, and I think that is continuing.
Yeah. You're an economist. Is it fair to say that increased government spending is a driver of inflation?
Absolutely, it tends to be, and let's not forget that when you introduce trillions of dollars of federal spending, the money has to come from somewhere, and that involves monetary policy where you're literally printing money to support this federal spending. And so I think where Americans are beginning to realize that injecting the economy with trillions of dollars of federal spending when the economy was already recovering. Jobs were already returning. Businesses, like these small businesses, were already trying to meet the demand, the supercharged demand. Inflation is the result of that. It was not the time for additional fiscal spending.
We've talked a lot about basically transportation fuels, input cost, but also the premature retirement of generation around the country and a push toward certain energy sources has driven utility cost up. Isn't that fair to say? For average
Absolutely. As I mentioned, the increase in utility costs for households has been, remarkable, over 50% in certain fuel costs, for example, or let's see here, 36% for heating oil, 32% for electricity, and natural gas up 25%. But altogether, the American household is not just weakened by inflation, it's also the high cost for borrowing, the high credit card bills, the high mortgage payments. All of this feeds into a weakened family financial position.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ms. Pryor, American farmers have faced unprecedented challenges over the last 4 years. You were very clear in your testimony due to rising energy cost and all the cost for input costs, transportation costs, et cetera. How does it feel to hear Vice President Harris and Democrat colleagues playing the blame on farmers and grocery stores for price gouging?
It's disheartening because we don't have any say over what a grocery store charges. And as I mentioned in my opening, our prices that we're paid for our crops have actually
You're told
decreased.
what someone would pay
We
for
are
your
price
apples, right?
takers, not price makers. The choice is take it or leave it, not what do you want your price to be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. How do high electricity prices impact your farm?
So in North Carolina, one of the changes that has occurred is I'll tell you exactly the name, the North Carolina Renewable Energy Standard, which requires, so in our area, Duke Energy is our only option for power, that they meet up to 12% of their energy needs through renewable energy resources or energy efficient measures. What seemed like could be beneficial once they put that in place, and I opened my power bill, there was a renewable energy rider that was to compensate for that expense that they incurred to do that. So they're not making a profit off of that, but they're passing it on to the customers. So it ends up costing the customer more for them to be able to meet that mandate.
Thank you for that. Mr. Fisher, real quickly, what's driving the 800% increase in PJM's capacity prices?
The short answer is supply and demand. Supply is being reduced by policies like I mentioned with the EPA shutting down significant swath of power plants. Demand's rising, and one sort of nerdy add-on to the question is that PJM finally right-sized the capacity contribution of intermittent resources. So all those changes together, we still need the power. It's growing, so prices are only going to go up.
Yeah, my time's expired. I'll now recognize the ranking member to get for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Ms. Pryor, first of all, I want to assure you that contrary to what the chairman said, the Democrats are not blaming farmers for high food prices. Now, grocery stores and chains, it's a different story, and I know my colleague Ms. Schreier is going to talk about that a little bit. Secondly, you really, I thought, persuasively described how your trucks have to drive long hours to take the corn to the processing plant, and that they use diesel for that. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And I just want to know, has any government, either your local, state, or federal government, mandated that you shift to electric vehicles, yes or no?
I don't know of any current mandates, no.
Yeah, there's no mandates, and I'm here to tell you, even if I have the gavel next time, I am not going to make a mandate for you to shift to electric vehicles. The other thing I just want to point out is I had staff pull the prices because high fuel prices do add to the cost of groceries, and they do add to farmers' costs. So in 2022, right after the huge spike and rise of fuel by the oil and gas companies, diesel was $5.81 a gallon. A year ago, it went down to $4.54 a gallon, and today, diesel is $3.56 a gallon. And I think it should be lower, but at least we're going in the right direction. Now, Mr. Fisher, I wanted to ask you, you contributed to Project 2025, correct?
That's correct.
And I want you just confirm to me, since you were one of the authors of Project 2025, that 900-page proposal calls for the elimination of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, the Office of State and Community and Energy Programs, and the Loan Programs Office, correct?
I believe that's correct, but I also want to clarify that I contributed more to the section on FERC than
Okay,
DOE.
but so yes or no? Does it propose eliminating those?
I believe that's true.
Okay. Now, we've also heard a lot about how Project 2025 seeks to consolidate power in the White House and wholly eliminate longstanding programs that don't support Republicans' fossil fuel agenda. So, Mr. Higgins, I want to ask you a couple questions. Mr. Fisher did confirm, sort of weekly, that Project 2025 calls for the elimination of EERE, SCEP, and LPO. By the way, that's on pages 379 and 369 of Project 2025, if anybody is uncertain. So I want to ask you, Mr. Higgins, about the impact which eliminating those offices and programs would have.
It's really an extraordinary proposal to eliminate the very programs that are helping to make sure that we have the technologies that we need to reduce costs, to invest in the future. The loans program has supported 47,000 new jobs already. It's critical in supporting the Ford Motor Company through the 2008 crisis. It helped today to make it possible for new investments in clean steel in Ohio. It's not just LPO. EERE does the research on energy efficiency. The Office of Clean Energy Deployment is for clean manufacturing demonstration, which is also supposed to be eliminated under the Project 2025 plans. These are extraordinary proposals.
And so if they did that, what effect, briefly, would the cuts have on the prices that American consumers pay?
It would raise prices to take away options for clean energy alternatives.
Okay. I was pleased to recently see companies like Florida Power and Light, DTE Energy, and Xcel announce millions in consumer savings thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. So, Mr. Higgins, I want to ask you, how much money do estimates show the Biden-Harris IRA will save American families on their electricity bills?
Electricity bills can be cut by up to 7% according to resources.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Up to 7%.
7%.
And overall, it will save households. We're on target to cut $2,000 per year over this next decade.
$2,000 per year. Now, did the bipartisan infrastructure law include funding for initiatives like the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, which lowers monthly energy bills for lower-income Americans and keeps homes safe during colder months?
Yes, it did. There was funding for the LIHEAP program that you just mentioned, as well as weatherization assistance. And in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are new tax credits and rebates so that low-income households who want to improve their energy efficiency can actually see 100% of their costs covered as these get rolled out through the states.
So, Mr. Chairman, I just want the record to reflect that even though all of my colleagues on your side of the aisle say that they're concerned about costs of utilities for consumers, not one person on this committee, not one Republican, voted for the IRA. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and thanks the panel for being here. And there was a reason we didn't vote for the IRA. And I'm glad I didn't. And would vote the same way again. Our constituents are struggling. Under the Biden-Harris administration's policies, energy prices have never been higher. That's a fact. Combined with record high inflation, people are having to make the choice between heating their homes, filling up their cars, or putting food on the table. Those are facts. Michigan families have been hit particularly hard. We have the highest residential price per kilowatt hour of any state in the Midwest. In fact, we have higher prices than 75% of the country. This is unsustainable, and Michiganians deserve much better than that. And that's a fact. As is their excuse for all high costs, the administration will claim that this is because of price gouging. But the facts show that that's not the case. States like California take significantly more money from the cost of gas than refiners' profits do. As of last week, $1.40 alone went to taxes, environmental initiatives, and unnecessary fees in the state. Plain and simple, unaffordable prices are the fault of the Biden-Harris administration's anti-American energy policies and their inflationary spending. Some of those policies include a forced transition to less reliable technologies. We've seen it with the EV, and yes, I'll say mandates, because if the standards are set so high that you have to go the direction, it's a mandate. We can use word salads on that, but it's still a mandate. And with regulations out of the EPA that force closures of affordable, reliable generation. Ms. Pryor, can you speak to how a transition to electric vehicles could impact costs and the ability for you and farmers like you to run your businesses? And second, what does that mean for the cost of food?
Like I tried to explain, I know it's difficult for people to imagine, those long hours and running equipment for that length of time. But with any crop, the corn that we're using the trucks for long hours or any other crop, time is of the essence, and you're competing against the weather or any other event that could happen, so you can't wait, especially if it's a perishable crop. So being able to operate for long hours and not have to stop. Once apples are loaded on a truck, they can't sit in the sun or they can't sit in heat or even extreme cold where they could be below freezing. So to have a truck loaded and then them be hauling them from North Carolina to Michigan, where a lot of ours go to processing, that's a long trip. And if they had to stop in either extreme heat or cold to charge, it would be detrimental to the fruit that they're hauling.
Yeah, I mean, the haylage that's going past my house right now and silage, they can't wait. The trucks that just fly past my house and they're coming back, ready for the tractor, ready for the unloading.
And that's what, so with corn, you have your combine bin is full or your grain cart is full, you're stopped until you can offload onto that truck. And for our farm, and I know a lot of other fellow farmers, we don't have the option of, well, we'll just have multiple trucks, so if one's charging, we'll run our other one. That's a huge expense. We have exactly the amount that we need, so we don't have a spare to be charging.
You are a just-in-time industry, that's for sure. Mr. Fisher, in your testimony, you discussed how the IRA isn't the boon to reliable American energy that it's sold as, but it actually threatens the power grid due to its reliance on subsidies and intermittent renewables. Can you unpack that for me and our committee a little bit further?
Yeah, so the Inflation Reduction Act is a series of subsidies. It was if you The thought experiment is you take something like the Green New Deal and squeeze it through a budget package. It's just subsidies. And what subsidies for intermittent resources do is they distort price signals. So in the US, power plants have to make money. If you're a coal-fired power plant, a gas-fired power plant, you need the market signal to produce and to stay online. What the subsidies do is not only force more of the intermittent resources than would show up otherwise, but also cuts into that revenue. So then what you see is those plants start closing, prices start going up, or you see even the reaction to that is basically you have to subsidize the reliable plants too. So it's a subsidy game that just it snowballs.
Never ends. My time has expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask a question about some of the proposals in Trump's Project 2025. The chapter on the Department of Energy is a Republican wish list of closed offices and shuttered programs, and you really don't see anything that would help reduce energy prices for Americans or combat the climate crisis. So we know that these extreme cuts will drive up costs for Americans, but I want to get into some of the details here. Trump's Project 2025 specifically calls for the elimination of energy efficiency standards for appliances. And as we know, this has been a major priority for Republicans this year, so I'm not surprised to see it spelled out in Project 2025. Let me ask Mr. Higgins, can you please elaborate on how the elimination of efficiency standards for appliances will actually increase energy costs for consumers?
Yes, thank you for the question. The Department of Energy has recently finalized standards for air conditioners, heat pumps, dishwashers, refrigerators. And when you add those together, the cost savings for households and businesses is roughly $1.9 billion per year. If we got rid of the tools that raise the standards on appliance manufacturers, we would wind up with more costly appliances that consumers would be forced to accept.
Well, thank you. I mean, essentially, Republicans claim to care about energy costs, but they're opposed to anything that actually reduces energy bills. So let me go to a second question I alluded to earlier in my opening. I want to talk about the collusion allegations that the FTC has presented against Scott Sheffield, the former CEO of America's largest independent oil producer. So, Mr. Higgins, could you talk about the pocketbook impact to Americans if oil companies were colluding with OPEC to keep crude oil and gasoline prices high?
This is an extraordinary story to learn that there were explicit messages talking about the desire to keep prices high. This was at a time when Russia had just invaded Ukraine. And in just 2 weeks' time, the price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States jumped 50 cents. That was extraordinary. And it's because although the crisis in Europe didn't raise domestic production costs, it did raise global price of oil. And that meant oil companies in the United States could profit off of the difference. And the people who paid the bill were American consumers. So in that time period, that 1 year, the global fossil fuel industry earned record profits of over $400 billion. And here in the United States, oil companies were not using that money to reinvest in production to boost supplies. In fact, the allegations that the FTC is looking into look at the statements they were making at the time about how they didn't want to be raising production because they were enjoying those prices. And instead, they took those profits and they poured them back into stock buybacks and dividends, more than $46 billion between 2021 and 2022, those 4 quarters. This is just an extraordinary opportunity for the oil and gas industry to profit off of fossil fuel price instability at the expense of the American consumers. And if we can finish the transition to clean energy, we don't have to be susceptible to that price volatility anymore.
Well, thank you. I have one more question, Mr. Higgins. The Biden-Harris administration has taken a number of steps to lower energy costs for American families, including programs created by the Inflation Reduction Act. Can you talk about some of the programs that are now making a difference in reducing energy costs?
Yeah, so the investments in clean electricity, which is the cheapest way to produce electricity, are being built because of these investments. That's driving down the average cost of electricity generation and helping to combat the price increases we would see due to all of the new load that's coming onto the system. At the same time, these programs are making it more affordable for households to be able to make the switch if they choose to. So that includes the new home energy rebates programs, which are just now being rolled out through the states. And they provide up to 100% of the costs for low-income households to switch to heat pumps, which can have a savings of up to $860 per year because it's so much more efficient than old electric resistance heaters or even natural gas furnaces. That's just one of the many programs here that's making it possible for people to participate in the clean energy economy.
Well, I appreciate that. Again, Republicans say they're supporting lowering costs for American families, but they voted more than 50 times to repeal parts of the Inflation Reduction Act that are actually lowering energy costs. So Democrats are going to continue to fight these Republican efforts and will instead look to build upon the action that we took with the Inflation Reduction Act. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the full committee chairwoman, the gentlelady from Washington, a champion for truth, Ms. Rogers.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the truth is, energy costs are increased across the board, directly driving inflation. Ms. Nwanka, I wanted to start with you. The ability of families to feel secure in their finances is so important to all of us and many Americans across the country. It's a sense of stability. The last 4 years have brought record levels, high levels of interest rates, borrowing costs. Housing is feeling more out of reach to young Americans. Add to this the cost of energy, and it affects the cost of other goods and services. It is one of the biggest drivers of the record inflation, and it is causing serious problems. Would you please speak about the combined impacts of high interest rates, inflation, high energy costs on the ability of families to feel secure, look to the future, and if there's any policies from this administration that you believe have led us to this place?
Thank you, Chair Rogers. You know, I began my remarks earlier just painting a picture of where the financial household situation for a lot of families are right now, and it's in a tenuous financial position. I've mentioned the fact that personal savings have fallen by $3 trillion. Average households have lost $2,000 of purchasing power. Real wages have actually have been negative for 25 months in a row. Real wages, not nominal, real, what people actually feel and take home every day. Collective credit card balances is a high of $1.1 trillion. This is average across the United States, but when you drill down on low-income families, on a lot of low-income Black families, you see these families are struggling to make tough choices. When 44% of households living near the poverty line are choosing between food and keeping warm or keeping cool in a year, it exposes that not only are prices high, but people are struggling and they're straining. And then there's also a larger sense that the American dream, the facets of buying a house tend to be out of reach. The idea of being able to afford a car, afford even your car payment is continuing to be out of reach. So that's where the American family is. And I always go back to the steps that we've seen when inflation took off in mid-2021 after the American Rescue Plan was enacted. We saw after that point large fiscal spending bills, whether you're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which President Biden recently, yesterday I believe, or 2 days ago, admitted was really not about reducing inflation. It should have been named something differently.
Thank you.
We recognize that the climate change investments are one thing, but actual bread and butter issues where people are is not where these energy policies or fiscal economic policies are really hitting and helping them.
Thank you for those insights. I have some more questions. Ms. Pryor, it's good to hear your perspective as a working farmer. I understand that you grow apples as a part of your business. I grew up on an apple orchard in eastern Washington, so I appreciate what you do. I wanted to ask you, American families are understandably concerned about the high cost of food. Would you speak to how high costs are passed through the supply chain and any insights you want to give us as far as how energy costs prevent you from charging competitive prices to what China offers when it comes to concentrate for apples?
So it's not my ability to charge. I have no ability to charge what my crops are worth. We are given a price, and we have a perishable product, so the choice is take it or leave it. It's not to negotiate after that price is given. It is a supply and demand issue, so if they can get their supply from elsewhere for cheaper, and that makes economic business sense for them, that's what they're going to do. Our food does not go directly to grocery stores. So for apples, we harvest them, pick them, we either take them somewhere where they are processed into an apple-containing product, or they are prepared, wash packed to go directly to a grocery store for fresh. There is a lot of concentrate coming in from other countries. We do grow a lot of processing apples, mainly puree, and it's a problem that I see. That's our competition. I'm not competing with Washington farmers. I'm competing with other farmers in other countries.
How does that impact food supply?
The supply is, I don't, as an American farmer, it is disheartening to me to think that we would be dependent on another country to feed our citizens. I want our citizens to be eating food that I'm growing. I'm very proud of what I do. And I know from, we had supply chain issues in 2020. We don't want to be dependent on another nation to feed us. We want to feed ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I have more questions, especially about why Washington State is paying among the highest grocery bills in the nation, but I'll have to follow up in writing. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the esteemed gentleman from California, Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Biden-Harris administration, through the IRA and the IIJA, has leveraged over $600 billion in private investment in American energy and manufacturing. It's the largest investment in climate action in the history of the world. We're here to talk today in part about the costs and benefits of these strong investments in America. But I also want to spend my time talking about the costs of inaction. Recent studies have found that the global costs of climate change stemming from extreme weather, increasing natural disasters, and other effects of a warming planet could reach $3.1 trillion a year by 2050. So this includes the cost of damage to infrastructure, property, and public health. These costs will increase over time as the impacts of climate change become more severe. For example, one issue threatening my state and my district, fueled by climate change, is the rising threat of catastrophic wildfire. Wildfire and wildfire risk continues to raise the cost of living, the cost of health care, and lower the quality of life for my constituents. Climate change, prolonged drought, and over a century of poor land management and oversuppression have led us to this point. As wildfires grow in frequency and in scale, people are feeling the harm not only on the environment, but in their wallets. Earlier this year, insurance rates for California homeowners increased by an average of 34%. Utility wildfire prevention and mitigation costs are also approaching $5 billion a year. We need a different approach, and I'll just call the attention of this committee to my bipartisan Fix Our Forests Act, which passed out of the Natural Resources Committee on a voice vote, which provides the Forest Service, the state, local, and tribal agencies with the necessary tools and support and leeway to deal with the threat of wildfires. It also takes significant steps to harden communities and invest in innovative research and development, building off several recommendations from the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission. Every dollar invested in reaching California's current forest management goals, residents get $4 in return in benefits. And each year California fails to meet these goals, residents pay $4 billion in otherwise avoidable damages. We no longer possess the luxury of a wait-and-see approach to climate issues like wildfire. We need to take bold action because the costs of doing nothing are so steep. So, Mr. Higgins, do you agree that the costs of doing nothing about climate change outweigh the costs of the action, particularly when we're talking about the investments that the Biden administration has lined up?
I strongly agree. The risks of climate change are severe, potentially irreversible, and highly costly. And fighting climate change is a way to fight inflation.
Do you have a sense of the economic investment, of reversing the economic effect of reversing these investments in our future, which the former president has promised to do if he's elected?
Yes, so the Energy Innovation has a great report looking at Project 2025, and if those proposals came to pass, it would cost 750,000 jobs directly, 1.7 million jobs when you count indirect jobs also, in 2035. It would cut economic growth, it would raise electricity prices, it would prolong dependence on gasoline. It's a very difficult set of policies to contemplate.
Thank you. On a specific issue, if you're able to comment on it, catastrophic fire has become the largest single source of particulate pollution in the United States. poses a major threat to communities, watersheds, and ecosystems. Are you able to address how climate threats, for example, the threat of catastrophic wildfire, is an economic and public health issue?
Yes, so wildfires have, as we've all seen here on the East Coast, been impacting the world at an increasing rate. I think we're only now just catching up to the realization that Californians have had for a long time. Climate change is causing harms today. So the average cost right now of wildfires, according to the Joint Economic Committee, was between $400 and $900 billion each year in economic costs and damages. That counts property damage, the direct and indirect deaths, health impacts from wildfire smoke, income loss, watershed pollution. These are very significant problems, and it's driving a home insurance affordability crisis. So insurance rates are up a third over 3 years nationwide. In California, it's obviously been much more difficult. The rates rose between 2015 and 2021, 800%.
Right. So using wildfire as an example, it's an illusion that we can avoid spending this money one way or the other. Spending it upfront is much more efficient. Investing today in preventing not only the rise in insurance costs, but also cancellation of policies and potentially catastrophic losses for homeowners is also is important. So I think we should keep that in context. So we talk about these costs, we're going to pay one way or the other. Let's pay it the smart way. Thank you for being here. Thanks to all the witnesses, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'll now go to Mr. Allen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of you for being here today and testifying on this important issue. You know, Americans across the country are suffering from high energy prices due to this administration's Rush to Green energy agenda. You know, this needs to be bottom up and not top down. I think every American, you know, wants a clean environment, and I'll tell you, America leads the world. We've reduced our carbon footprint 10 times what any other nation has done, and we're doing our part here. The war on fossil fuels and regulatory climate are making energy prices unsustainable, and this is impacting every sector of our economy. We just came back from our August district work period, and the top issue I heard from my constituents is how their bills keep increasing. I also have a very agricultural heavy district, and I have heard from farmers. In fact, I just met with the peanut growers with the devastating impacts that high energy prices are having and input costs are having on their bottom line. Ms. Pryor, one issue I hear about from my farmers is their high input cost. In your estimation, what percentage of your input costs are for fuel? Yeah.
I don't know the exact percentage, but I could definitely get back with you on that as soon as I'm home this evening.
Right.
But the increase, you know, for a very comparable amount of fuel was from 57,000 to 83,600 in just from 21 to 23.
Right. So it's significant.
And that's not something that we don't get to add a fuel surcharge or something to compensate for that.
Right. And so you're saying that you're dependent on the market, but then input costs are rising drastically.
Correct.
So what do you do in the meantime?
Absorb it as long as you can, and then when's the breaking point? I don't know. Diversification, we try hard to look at every possible option. That's why we grow more than one type of crop, to try to make ourselves as strong as possible so that we can ride out times. But we've had consecutive years now, and the projection this year will be the same. So this will be our second year in a row to not have a profit. And
We are at the breaking point. And we can talk all we want to do about climate. When people start going hungry, we're going to hear about it, folks. I'm going to tell you that. We're at that breaking point. I've been in the district, I've listened, and I'm going to tell you, a lot of these folks, they're not going to get the loans to plant next year. And we're messing around up here with this, a national security issue? You have to be kidding me.
farmers don't go out of business due to lack of hard work. They go out of business due to lack of cash flow.
And the investment that we put into national security risk is like the eye of a needle compared to the economic impact and national security interests of our food supply. And we can't make this place up here understand that. It absolutely, oh no, we got to worry about, let me tell you how to deal with wildfires. We do it down south. We manage our forests. Our private forest owners manage our forests. It's the public lands where we can't manage. Y'all, we were created to adapt. And we're just allowing these things to happen. It's because people have lost all common sense in how to deal with these issues. It is amazing to me. Ms. Is it Onwuka? Yes. Did I get that right? Before Congress, I was a small business owner, and I know firsthand how these regulations and prices impact businesses. As you noted in your testimony, energy is a top business expense for 35% of small businesses. From your experience, how is the rising cost of energy impacting operations at small businesses?
Well, thank you for your question, sir. When you look at what businesses are spending right now, it costs small businesses to heat their buildings, run their equipment, ship their products. They're also facing increases in prices from their suppliers. So they're forced, unfortunately, to pass these higher costs on to customers. Interestingly, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, NFIB, found that energy costs are one of the top 3 business expenses and concerns for small businesses right now. So, they're struggling. As much as households are struggling, small businesses are struggling. And if they can't make ends meet because of energy costs, they need to face that existential threat.
And Ms. Pryor, fertilizer, is just another thing. I've got a few additional questions, Mr. Chairman, but I'm out of time and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now I'll go to Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for joining us here today. For many families, including many of my constituents in Sacramento, energy bills are a serious financial burden, and I'm committed to reducing that burden. But I want to highlight the misinformation that lies at the heart of this hearing. Clean energy is not the reason for high gas prices. In fact, clean energy is critical to making energy affordability for consumers in the long term. Now, there's no question that the cost of gas has increased since 2021, but it's not because of clean energy. It's because there was a global oil shortage. Mr. Higgins, what happened in early 2022 that caused a global oil shortage?
The biggest factor was Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Okay.
Which disrupted the entire energy system globally.
Absolutely. I find it odd that Republicans are blaming the Biden-Harris administration for high gas prices when Russia's invasion of Ukraine has clearly been a key factor in driving high gas prices. Now, it's not just gasoline prices. Electricity prices also spiked in 2022 because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Higgins, very briefly, can you talk about how the invasion of Ukraine affected natural gas prices and U.S. electricity bills?
So it raised gasoline prices, I mentioned a few minutes ago, because the price of oil is set globally. Natural gas prices used to be set domestically, but as we've increased our export capacity, we've increased the exposure to the U.S. economy to global natural gas prices. That means that this crisis hurt us. And since 40% of our electricity system is based on natural gas right now, when natural gas prices go up, it drives electricity prices up.
Okay, now, states that added more wind and solar to the grid between 2010 and 2023 tend to have lower electricity bills. Mr. Higgins, when compared with natural gas, why would clean energy be associated with lower electricity bills?
So the cost of installing solar and wind takes some work, which is why the Inflation Reduction Act invests in getting them built. Once they are built, they just run. They don't have an ongoing fuel cost. They are the cheapest form of electricity available.
Okay. Now, as you said, clean energy is cheap, abundant, and reliable. And last Congress, Democrats passed historic legislation to make it even cheaper. Mr. Higgins, how much do you expect the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill to save American families on their energy bills?
We're on a very good trajectory right now. And so by 2035, which is just 10 years away, we could see, according to the latest estimates from the Rhodium Group, that household energy spending would be cut by a third, which is an annual savings of $2,000 a year.
Oh, can you briefly explain where those savings are coming from?
Some of it comes from reduced spending on electricity because of increased efficiency. Some of it comes from counteracting the price impacts of increased demand on the electricity grid by switching to clean electricity. A lot of it comes from the households that do switch to electric vehicles because it works for them, no longer having to pay gasoline. And this insulates the entire economy from price volatility.
Okay, now it's not just about lowering electricity bills, but it's also about bringing manufacturing back to this country and providing high-paying jobs for hardworking Americans. Mr. Higgins, how has the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law impacted investment in U.S. manufacturing?
Clean energy manufacturing investment has quadrupled in the 2 years since the Inflation Reduction Act compared to the 2 years prior. That's an extraordinary new growth. It's more than tripled for battery investment. There's been $75 billion in car-related investments. So the EVs, the batteries, critical mineral processing. This is set to create and sustain 330,000 new jobs per year in the United States.
That's great. Now, Republicans have made clear in their Project 2025 plan that they will fully repeal the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law and shut down these new factories. The new Redwood Materials battery plant in Charleston, South Carolina, Hyundai in Georgia, LG in Michigan and Arizona, Honda in Ohio. Workers at these plants are counting on the Inflation Reduction Act. Mr. Higgins, what would happen to these factories if the Inflation Reduction Act is repealed?
I think that pulling the support that these factories were counting on as they calibrated their investments would be disastrous. And it's exactly what China is hoping for. I just visited China to press them on climate action. And the number one question that they have is whether the Inflation Reduction Act will be repealed, because they are very concerned about these manufacturing investments in the United States and are in fact challenging them in front of, challenging the EV tax incentives in particular in front of the World Trade Organization, trying to repeal them.
Thank you very much, and my time has expired. I yield
Generally
back.
yields back. I now go to Dr. Burgess, the Chair of the Rules Committee. Chairman Burgess, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fisher, not fair to do this to you, but I just wonder if you have any observations on the things that you've just heard about the Elysian fields of clean energy that we're now finding ourselves in.
I appreciate the question, sir. The thing that stands out to me is I keep hearing that new clean resources are the cheapest, they're affordable, they're the best. It is interesting to me that we would have to subsidize them to the tune of $3 trillion federal dollars if they are already the cheapest, and it's confusing to me why states would have to mandate these resources.
So I'm from Texas. We have our own electrical grid. May have heard about it. It's been in all the papers. So during the month of August, I come home and I watch what's happening on the ERCOT website. Texas is a leader in wind and solar. So last summer, a lot of solar energy was produced. That's a good thing. The problem is that the sun goes down. And it seems to be a predictable phenomenon. It occurs about in the summertime in Texas. It's about 8 p.m. in the time zone that I live in. People are getting home. They open their front door. They realize, oh my gosh, it's hot as hell in here. Crank up the AC. And just as they're cranking up the AC and driving electricity demand, the sun sets. And there is no energy on the grid. So several times, ERCOT on its website has put out a warning saying, hey, we're getting dangerously close to that imbalance period. You need to have the energy resources from reliable thermogenic resources like natural gas, like nuclear. And if you don't have that as part of your mix, I don't care how good you are in wind and solar. And Texas is good. They've made significant investments. They've made those with state dollars, not with federal dollars. And the other thing I'm just obligated to point out, I just came from a budget hearing. We have got a massive deficit problem in this country right now. So when we talk about a couple of $1 billion for a clean energy project, add 50% to that, because that's the carrying cost that you're going to be paying interest to the Chinese in order to do this thing that you want to do. Now look, I apologize for not being here the entire time. We've got 3 different hearings in 3 different buildings, and it's a challenge, as it always is. I heard my I heard my ranking member of the full committee disparage something he calls Project 2025. But Center for American Progress also has an agenda, and it's available. No one's talking about it very much. So I go on the website of Center for American Progress, and this is not just an incidental. I mean, the domestic policy advisor in the White House is the former head of the Center for American Progress, Neera Tanden. She's put in that job because it didn't require Senate confirmation, and she got herself in hot water with some other comments that she made that she couldn't go through Senate confirmation. But what I also found in looking at things on the Google machine, nobody really knows the donors behind the Center for American Progress. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record, here's an article from The Nation, hardly a right-wing enterprise, the secret donors behind the Center for American Progress. So this
Without
is
objection,
recently
so ordered.
updated. The other thing I'd like to submit for the record, I've been on this committee for a long time. In the middle of the pandemic, because of demand destruction caused by all industry having to shut down, albeit temporarily, but it still was a big disruption on our energy producing sector, and the price of oil plummeted. It seemed to me to be logical at that point, in the middle of July of 2020, that with the price so low, this would be a very opportune time to build up our supplies in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Senator Cornyn and I had a bill to do just that. I also will submit for the record an op-ed, a brilliant op-ed, I might point out, written by Senator Cornyn and myself, about how the Strategic Petroleum Reserve should be replenished during this time of relatively low prices. And then we saw what happened literally 2 years later when President Biden decided there was a political emergency and he had to drain the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in order to prevent there being a bloodbath in the midterm elections. And yet we sit here today with a big tropical storm, Francine, churning in the Gulf, and all of the Gulf production is having to be shut in, albeit for a few days. But that's the reason you have a Strategic Petroleum Reserve, because if something like that happens, then America doesn't suffer because of this natural disaster that's been visited upon us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm a little bit over. I apologize, and I'll yield back.
Mr.
Chairman
Chairman.
yields back, and without
Mr.
objection,
Chairman?
so ordered.
No,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, I would just point out that this article that the gentleman offers for admission to the record is dated May 22, 2013. It's 11 years old, but for whatever minimal use it might be, I will not object to its admission in the record.
Gentlelady's correct, the date on it's correct, but we're going to submit it to the record without objection. Now I'll go to my friend, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We should dispense with the myth that Americans' energy affordability issues started in January of 2021. For millions, energy insecurity has always been their reality. In both 2015 and 2020, long before the Biden administration, the Energy Information Administration found that more than a quarter of U.S. households reported difficulty paying their energy bills or keeping their home at an unsafe temperature because of energy cost concerns. Millions of Americans have reported foregoing food and medicine to pay energy bills. For decades, Congress has funded proven and effective programs to support low-income Americans with home energy affordability, such as LIHEAP and the Weatherization Assistance Program. Homes receiving weatherization services save on average a $372 total every year. Mr. Higgins, can you tell us about the importance of programs like the Weatherization Assistance Program and why Congress provided historic supplemental funding for it in the infrastructure law?
Thank you, Representative Tonko. Yep, the Center for American Progress is transparent about our funding sources and our recommendations. We do put things on the website, so I would be happy to respond to the representative from Texas in writing since he's now gone. One of the things that we work really hard on, though, is, as you raised, trying to make sure that low-income households have an opportunity to afford their energy bills and make improvements to their energy efficiency. And the Weatherization Assistance Program, the LIHEAP program, the new home energy rebates programs are key. So the Weatherization Assistance Program, for example, provides an average of $280 in annual cost savings to the households who participate and supports over 8,500 jobs for weatherization to go and help households improve. The Home Energy Rebates Program can save up to $1 billion annually in ongoing costs for American households. And LIHEAP last year provided 5 million households with heating cost assistance, which includes, that's $3 billion in heating assistance, over $500 million for cooling assistance, which is sort of a new mandate for their program, given how much worse extreme heat is becoming, and $500 million for weatherization.
All right, thank you for that. Other members have brought up Project 2025 today, and that proposal also has something to say about our existing programs to support low-income families with their energy bills. Project 2025 wants to eliminate DOE's Office of State and Community Energy Programs, which includes weatherization and other, and I quote, special interest funding programs. Personally, I do not believe federal efforts to help struggling Americans is a special interest. Now, I am sure my colleagues across the aisle will say Project 2025 is not an official campaign platform. But we can look at Donald Trump's actual actions as president, where his budget requests consistently propose zeroing out these critical programs. So, Mr. Higgins, if programs like weatherization and LIHEAP are eliminated, what would be the consequences for our low-income community of Americans?
Low-income households would be left exposed to extreme heat, to extreme cold. They would be unable to address, or less able to address their own energy needs. These support programs help renters, homeowners, everyone to be able to afford the energy bills they need to pay and avoid the types of terrible trade-offs between food and energy or sports practices or whatever it is that the households need to balance. These are great programs that help a lot of people.
Thank you. If we really want to address persistent energy insecurity, we should be working together to strengthen proven programs that work. I have proposed the Weatherization Enhancement and Readiness Act to make modest reforms that will ensure the already available funding is spent even more effectively. I would encourage the subcommittee to consider legislation along these lines. Project 2025 has also proposed eliminating DOE's Efficiency Standards Program. Once again, we can look at House Republicans' actual actions this Congress to advance legislation that would gut this program. The Appliance Standards Awareness Project found that efficiency standards save the average household more than $500 each year on utility bills. And ironically, on the floor, we are considering bills to appear to be tough on China. But by eliminating minimum efficiency standards, we will be allowing China to dump poorly made, inefficient products into the U.S. market at the expense of American manufacturers and American consumers. Mr. Higgins, when we lower our standards, whether that be for energy efficiency or other performance or safety standards, can you explain how that race to the bottom benefits our foreign competitors like China?
China actually exports a fair number of air conditioners to other parts of the world, and they have watched with concern as we've raised our standards because it has jeopardized their ability to dump inefficient air conditioners onto the developing world. That's a problem for people everywhere. When we raise our standards, it puts pressure on the whole rest of the world to do better, and that benefits not just low-income households here, but also in Africa and Southeast Asia, places where air conditioning is a matter of life and death.
Well, somebody claim Project 2025 is an unofficial blueprint, but whether it's eliminating weatherization or gutting efficiency standards, it's clear that Donald Trump and many Republicans in Congress have already been using this playbook. And with that, Mr. Chair, I say thank you and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now go to the chair of the O&I Subcommittee, Mr. Griffith, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I greatly appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I think we've just provided a copy of the Martinsville Bulletin article by Bill Wyatt related to electricity rate increases likely, and I would move that we have that submitted into the record if appropriate. And y'all can look at it later and get back to me on that.
Without objection, so ordered.
In that article, and it was based on the PJM, so eventually I will come to you, Mr. Fisher, for a question. But in that article, the Martinsville Bulletin reporter, Bill Wyatt, went through and took what the PJM's Executive Vice President, Stu Bressler, said the increase would be based on the fact that the PJM price for capacity reservation went from $28 in the most recent auction this summer to $270 per megawatt per day. And as a result of that, they took the numbers from PJM, they calculated them. I had sent out a statement, in all fairness, and they calculated that in the Martinsville, Henry County area, the average monthly bill of $206 would increase to $343. Now, it gets a little complicated for folks watching back home. I know you know this, but the reserve capacity or the capacity reservation means we're gambling on next year's cost on a particularly hot or a particularly cold day when electricity is being used a lot. And while it only accounts for about 8% of the overall cost in the bill, it does mean that rates have to go up when you jump from $28 per megawatt per day to $270 or almost $270 per megawatt per day. So the question to you is, and you can tell I'm alarmed, and I know you touched on it, what's that going to mean for constituents back home? Not just the price increase that I've already mentioned, that Mr. White went through and did the extra homework to come up with his own number of what that was going to cost his readership. But what does that mean when that price goes up? Does that mean brownouts, blackouts, or does it just mean people have to not have air conditioning or not have heat? And I would remind you that in our region, we went down a couple of Christmases ago to about 3 degrees. Go ahead, Mr. Fisher.
As a resident of the state of Maryland, I was alarmed as well when I saw the Consumer Council there published a range that could be as high as a 24% increase in retail rates just due to the PJM capacity auction. That's unfortunate, but I do think prices give us a signal. Prices tell us something. And what the PJM capacity prices are telling us are, it's the combined reality on the ground, supply and demand. So we're reducing supply through EPA regs and other things. We are having significant load growth, which would be overall a good story. That's a positive story. That means economic growth. But load growth in the context of supply constraints means prices are going to skyrocket, and that's exactly what's happening.
And I'm sure somebody's touched on this before, and I'm chairing a hearing upstairs, so that's why I wasn't here earlier. But when I was a young lawyer a number of years ago, the Appalachian footprint in Southwest Virginia was the 3rd lowest electric rates in the country, and that was because of coal and natural gas. But now we're on average with the average, and with PJM's reserve capacity auction, we're probably going to be slightly above average next year is my guess. And part of what makes these rates go up, and you tell me if I'm wrong on these, part of what makes these rates go up not only is the push to go away from the fossil fuels, but the fact that we have facilities that are built that are supposed to last another 20 or 30 years, and now we're having to rebuild because those don't expect that they'll be around in 10 years based on Green New Deal and other policies passed and encouraged by the Biden-Harris administration. Am I correct on that?
That's exactly right. And the only thing I would add is the cheapest electricity that we have is from a power plant that's already built, that's already been in operation, especially if it has useful life going forward. It is a real shame to shut those power plants down because that is the cheapest energy we've got.
And those are exactly the kind of power plants I have, and it is illogical to think that we're going to get rid of all of that. I'm happy for us to move to nuclear. I'm happy for us to move to hydrogen. I'm happy for us to move to wind and solar, as long as we're not sacrificing the people in my district who have, the average has gone over $50,000. The average household income in my district is a little over $50,000 a year. You suddenly start raising your electric rates to where the average in that Martinsville, Henry County area is going to be about $343, if I remember correctly. That's a real impact on these families, and it's going to mean that people are going to have to cut something out, and it means they're probably going to go cold or get excessively hot in the summer. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the consideration of my colleagues, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and such a great discussion that we're having today. Ms. Pryor laid out, and I thought it was really interesting for people to understand about how fuel price can have upward pressure on food prices. I thought that was really interesting. One of the other things that I hope that Ms. Pryor and others are talking about too is how labor and the shortage of labor can put upward pressure on prices. As you know, there was an opportunity for us to pass a bipartisan immigration bill this Congress, and Trump thought that the bill would help President Biden get reelected when he was still the nominee. And so Trump supposedly talked to the Speaker of the House and asked him to jettison the bill so we would not be able to pass it. That's something that would have would be very disadvantageous to your particular industry and put upward cost on the prices of apples for all consumers across the land to have to pay. And so being able to tackle immigration reform and being able to fix on the flaws in the system that hurts businesses like yours is something that this Congress needs to address, along with coming up with sensible energy solutions. And speaking of sensible energy solutions, low-income families, obviously, in the state of Texas have been hit very hard when it comes to their electric bills. We have very hot summers in Texas. I don't think that I have to tell anybody that. Sometimes we'll have 20, 30 plus days of 100-degree days over the summer months. And the IRA is helping to lower bills in Texas, which I think is awesome. And we're creating a lot of jobs in the Lone Star State because of the IRA. An estimated $66.5 billion of investment in large-scale clean power generation and storage is expected to come to Texas between now and 2030. And there are so many other areas. And I know that, Mr. Higgins, in your testimony, you cited Texas, and our wind and solar industry saved about $11 billion in wholesale electricity costs in 2022. With that in mind, can you elaborate on how the IRA specifically helps low and middle income families reduce their energy bills? Because as you know, in order for these new cleaner technologies to really be successful and be embraced by the American public, not only do they have to be reliable, but they have to be affordable. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, I'm happy to. The clean energy that's adding to the system helps save money and lower electricity prices. As you mentioned, the large number, just on a daily basis, that's $20 million per day in avoided fuel costs alone. Those savings help people who are really exposed to electricity prices, which include low-income households who spend 20% of their incomes on energy bills and transportation fuel. That's triple the typical household expenditure. It's just a larger proportion of their expenses. And they often, a low-income household often is not in charge, either they don't own the house, or if they do, they haven't had a chance to upgrade the efficiency. So they, households that low-income households live in pay 20 cents more per square foot on energy because they have poor drafty conditions or inefficient ways to keep to avoid the sun and to do the air conditioning. So the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law are investing in programs like LIHEAP and weatherization assistance. There are tax incentives for the purchase of new appliances. But for households that don't have a tax bill, that's not as helpful, which is why the Inflation Reduction Act also creates rebates. So if you're a low-income household, you can get up to 100% of the costs of upgrading your home covered by the bill. And that includes electric panel upgrades you might need, as well as the actual appliances. So I just mentioned a couple of the programs. There are many more. These are just rolling out now. The states are only starting to implement that rebate program I mentioned. So the savings we are going to see here, I think, could be really beneficial for people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in closing here, you know, the West Texas Intermediate dropped and closed, to below $67 a barrel yesterday. I was just wondering how the clean energy infrastructure under the IRA can contribute to long-term stabilization of energy prices, not just in Texas, but across the country.
Right. So as you mentioned, the crude oil prices now are half of what they were in 2022. And gasoline prices have gone down from $5 to about $3.33. So it's been a major trend. The thing is, we don't want to be left in a position to have to pay those high prices again the next time global supplies are interrupted. And the Inflation Reduction Act, as you mentioned, is helping to protect us against those by giving consumers options that will leave them less dependent on these fuels.
Absolutely. Amen to lower gas prices. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Latta for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for this very important hearing today, and thanks for our witnesses for being here. I have a very unique district. I know the members on this committee have heard me say it a lot of times, but I have 86,000 manufacturing jobs, largest in the state of Ohio. but I also have the largest farm income producing district in the state of Ohio. Agriculture runs deep in our area, and my mom's family, they settled family farms in the 1840s, and my mom was raised on the family farm, one of 7 kids. My wife comes from a family farm up in Williams County that was settled in 1835, and the family's still on it, and they've gone through good times and bad times like everyone else has. But, one of the things that as I drive across my district and see what's going on out there, it's important because, the crops are out there right now. In another month and a half, hopefully, that we're going to start seeing the production of taking out the crops. But, Ms. Pryor, if I could ask you some questions, because again, when I read your testimony, it was very interesting and also hit home because prior to this hearing, I got a letter from a farmer in my district. And when I look at in your testimony, when you're talking about, your production costs and what's happened in the last several years, and you said, and since 2021, when we spent $57,000 for diesel and gasoline compared to 2023 when we spent $83,000. And, I'm looking at what they did, and they broke things down in this letter. But they're showing that in 2021, they had about $122,000 in fuel costs, and then they're projecting this year being at $180,000. And then their fertilizer costs are up from $580,000 to $900,000. And again, because a lot of people don't realize, sometimes when they think about oil and natural gas, they think that's the things we're powering things with or heating with, but not realizing what we're making out of those products for fertilizers. They're so important for our farmers. And if I could, just, when you look at what's happening for your farm, and I know you really pointed out in your written testimony, but when you look at your farm costs out there and the higher energy costs and peripheral costs, fertilizer, fuel and equipment, et cetera, how have you been, trying to manage that? Because again, you got to have a bottom line out there, and where do you see that bottom line heading you, saying that production is going to cost us more than we're going to be taking in?
This year, we will have a negative, and the USDA projection, farming as a whole will have the second consecutive year of having a loss. But last year we broke even. This year we're not going to do that. We're going to have a loss. That scares me, but we try to plan, and there's huge risk, and I think goes back to Farm Bill, and that helps relieve some of those risks that we take. And if we have some support to fall back on and plan on and be reliable, then it's easier to take those calculated risks. But with no fallback, it's much harder, because then you're looking at your prices that you can't control and weather that you can't control, and that's a lot of variables to make it even riskier. But we farm because we love it, and it is our livelihood, but it is also our life, and there's nothing else that we want to do. And so just to say, oh, well, it wasn't profitable, we're going to close and do something else, that's really not an option. And it's not, having the equipment and the ability to grow different crops, that takes time too. So we are constantly, for us, the processing market for apples is changing, and we know that, and we're not naive to that. And so we will look at other options and other types of apples and varieties that we can grow and set. But it takes planning. You're looking at 5 years from setting to your first harvest. So it's not something that we can just change overnight and, this isn't working, we're going to switch.
Let me ask this, I only have about 38 seconds left in my time remaining. How do you plan, especially on energy costs, when you see the energy costs going up? How do you plan when you budget for the year for your farming? I'm sorry, I only got about 26 seconds left.
I would love to be able to budget. There is no budget, because how can there be? It's so variable, and we don't know what we're going to get paid for a crop until it's right at time to harvest it. So there's no way to, it would be great if we could have a better idea and some more security as to what things are going to cost, but there's no way, especially when you don't know what price you're going to get for your crop until it's time to harvest.
Well, I appreciate the witnesses for being here, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having today's hearing. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Custer's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I just want to start by saying on the record, the Democrats are totally in favor of passing a farm bill, and it's the Republican leadership that's holding it up. So here we are at what may be the last energy subcommittee hearing of this Congress, and rather than examining the many issues facing our nation and its energy system, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are once again trying to spin a partisan message about energy prices. The majority seems more focused on partisanship than facts. So here are the facts. Under President Biden, the United States is producing more energy than ever before. In fact, the United States produces more oil and natural gas than any other country. Thanks in part to this record energy production, wholesale natural gas prices are 30% lower under President Biden than they were under President Trump. Gasoline in my district right now is $3.19. Record U.S. energy production is also helping our allies, providing energy security to our friends and reducing the influence of malevolent foreign regimes. Thanks to the work of the Biden-Harris administration and House Democrats, we've also set the stage for the United States to dominate clean energy markets. The Inflation Reduction Act is turbocharging U.S. investment in renewable energy projects, helping to drive down U.S. carbon emissions. In 2023, carbon emissions from the electric power sector declined by 7%. If we pass meaningful permitting reform to help us speed the construction of new transmission projects and the relicensing of existing hydropower facilities, both issues that Democrats on this committee are working hard to accomplish but have been thwarted by the Republican partisanship, we can continue to drive down carbon emissions and meet the Biden-Harris administration's carbon goals. The Inflation Reduction Act is also turbocharging investment in the domestic manufacturing needed to supply future clean energy projects. This domestic manufacturing means new jobs, and the Biden-Harris clean energy agenda is creating a green-collar workforce for the future. Now, let's contrast this with Project 2025, the Republican playbook for what they want to do in the energy policy space if Donald Trump were to win the White House again. Project 2025 would repeal all energy efficiency standards for appliances. These energy efficiency standards are predicted to save Americans over $1 trillion in energy costs over the next 30 years. Mr. Higgins, my first question is for you. How would actions like eliminating energy efficiency standards impact hardworking American families?
The energy efficiency standards are set to save almost $2 billion a year in energy costs, and eliminating the opportunity to continue to improve efficiency standards or even rolling those back would just make it harder for people to afford their monthly budget.
And to pay their bills. Thank you. Project 2025 would also undermine the independence of regulatory commissions like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Mr. Higgins, my second question is to you. How would curtailing the independence of these regulators hurt hardworking American families?
Having a reliable regulatory system for things like nuclear power plants, I think is critical for industry and for the public to trust that future investments are safe and worth making. The same thing with the Federal Energy Regulatory System. The Commission is responsible for getting transmission built, permitting pipelines even. And if we can't have a reliable regulator who plays fair and addresses the problems of today, we're going to have trouble building the new grid that we need to remain competitive globally and see economic growth.
Would you venture to have an opinion as to whether Project 2025 will raise or lower energy prices for hardworking American families?
I'm confident, based on modeling I've seen and the analysis of the programs, that Project 2025, if implemented, would raise energy costs, not just above where we're hoping they will decline to, but above where they have been.
Including farmers?
Yes, I would think so. There's more than $20 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act that we hope will see renewed in the Farm Bill that will help diversify the revenue streams for farmers. And this is helping to protect small businesses even as they face fluctuating commodity prices that are influenced by energy costs and extreme weather.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Chair yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate y'all being here. I had to go to a Science, Space, and Technology Committee, so I didn't get to hear a lot of your testimony, but I heard a lot of something just now, so I am up to speed, I suspect one could say. Mr. Fisher, in his testimony before this committee in July, FERC Commissioner Mark Christie opened by stressing that, quote, the United States is heading for potentially catastrophic consequences in terms of the reliability of our electric power system, end quote. In part because dispatchable power plants are retiring too quickly. A few days later, we talked about PJM. The largest grid operator in the nation announced that prices in its most recent capacity auction rose substantially. And Mr. Griffin talked about that. PJM noted that one of the drivers of the higher prices, and I'm quoting now, is, quote, decreased supply offers into the auction due mainly to generator retirements, end quote. At a time when policymakers and regulators should be emphasizing actions to sustain existing power plants, the EPA continues rulemakings likely to shut down generation critical to the very electric reliability we are seeking. In April, the EPA announced an unworkable, unrealistic fuel rule, maybe I'll do it that way, focused on existing coal and new natural gas plants. And in July, the administration announced that the EPA will release a proposed rule in December cracking down on carbon emissions from existing plants. You can't make this stuff up. So my question to you is, what do you anticipate will be the net result from the continued retirement of dispatchable power plants like natural gas generation at a time when increased demand for electricity is going to require significantly more generation? What impacts do you believe that those actions I described will have on ratepayers?
Increased prices, reduced reliability, for certain.
Would you say 20%, 30%? We really don't know how bad it will be, do we?
Well, the PJM capacity price increase was eightfold.
Right.
I'm not sure if that's going to happen across the board, but that is a signal. That's a sign of the times.
Absolutely. Ms. Pryor, I'm going to jump over to you. I appreciate some of your comments. I did get a chance to read through some of your information. I owned an air conditioning company for 35 years. We dealt with power requirements all the time. Somebody's building a house, we knew exactly how much electricity that house was needed. When y'all are talking about the EPA and the federal government requiring that you redo a whole house, I think, Mr. Higgins, you had that conversation, and it would even be paid for the whole house and all the appliances. Do you have any idea what a complete change-out air conditioning system costs? It's unbelievable, and you're talking about all new appliances and air conditioning system. Somebody's got to pay that dime, and it's the taxpayers who aren't getting their houses upgraded. Ms. Pryor, coming back to you, do you know any farmers who use electric trucks for farming?
I don't personally know of any. We do have one small college near us that I know has a tractor that is, and they're trying to give it a good try, and it's not able to do everything that they.
Well, when you need to get all that you can out of a diesel tractor or diesel 18-wheeler, you don't have time to stop and recharge the battery. You just don't. Not only that, but as you know, the battery adds to the weight factor on these trucks, and you can't carry as many goods as otherwise you would have. From your experience and in your opinion, Ms. Pryor, sticking with you, do you believe that American consumers are aware that the increased price of food in grocery stores, I'm going to do this in two parts, corresponds with higher energy costs, which you have to absorb? And the second part is, most kids think that, you know, apples and meat and milk comes from H-E-B in Texas. Well, it doesn't. You think it's going to increase your cost?
Oh, it definitely increases my cost. Was your first part of the question, did I think people realize?
Do you think Americans are really aware of that?
No, not at all. I do a lot to try to advocate for agriculture and just education, and people don't realize what goes into it. So even, let's say, strawberries, the plastic clamshell that they're in, the plastic costs more because of petroleum.
Right.
The cereal box, the plastic bag that's inside, everything is increased. All those input costs are increased, and that's one
The
of the
war
big
on
drivers
fossil
behind it.
fuels has hurt us because, for one thing, we're not teaching young people exactly how badly we need petroleum products just in every facet of our life. Mr. Onwook, am I saying that right?
On WUCA.
Okay, I'm coming to you, yes or no. Do you believe that the average American can afford to pay $9,000, and that's low, I was in that business, to retrofit their homes with climate-friendly appliances? You believe the average homeowner can afford that?
No, they can't.
Yes or no, do you believe that it's acceptable that 37% of households reported difficulty paying for usual household expenses, including utility bills? Is that acceptable?
No.
And we're only going to make it worse. Mr. Chairman, I could go on, but I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll go to Dr. Schreier for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. During this hearing, we've heard a lot of points made about high prices related to energy costs, but I'd like to shift focus to the core of what I'm hearing from my constituents and farmers and seeing in my district. Washington State consumers pay particularly high prices, and farmers have very high input costs. My constituents, both the farmers and customers, are hurting. In addition to these increased input costs, farmers are having to deal with being squeezed at the other end of the pipeline. I have heard firsthand about the very heavy-handed tactics that grocery store chains use to negotiate, or as you put it, Ms. Pryor, just set the rock-bottom prices that they will pay farmers and growers. Your testimony, Ms. Pryor, reads like what I hear from farmers in the district. We have the apple farmers in north central Washington. You already made very clear in your testimony that you are price takers and not price makers or negotiators. So let me be clear about this, that while big corporate supermarket chains are playing hardball with farmers and demanding the lowest prices, they've exploited the pandemic-era supply chain challenges to rake in profits, and then they continue to this day, even though the supply chains are no longer strained the way they were. For example, Kroger reported only a slight increase in sales through fiscal year 2023, but its sales and operating profits have continued to rise, I mean, to the point of almost 45% in 2023 alone. So sales stayed stagnant, prices and profits up. Also, in an email disclosed by a court filing, a Kroger executive even admitted that milk and egg prices were significantly higher than what was needed to account for inflated costs. And this happens with dairy as well. So the high prices we're seeing at the grocery stores, by the way, are not just from these hikes at the stores themselves. There's gouging all along the supply chain. For example, 3 companies, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and Keurig Dr. Pepper, control 90% of the bottled beverage industry sold in the US. They've all cut production. They've all increased prices. So they're selling less, making their cost of production lower, but they are making significantly more profit. And they pass that on to the grocery stores. But then that doesn't just get passed on to us. The grocery stores pad those prices even more. Basically, they're blaming inflation to cause even more inflation. And then we expect high prices, so we continue to pay them, and they deliver. Right now, families in Washington State face the 4th highest average weekly grocery bill among 48 states. And at the same time, I've spoken with farmers in my district who've been put out of business in the last year alone because the supermarkets keep lowballing them while charging us the high prices. Ms. Pryor, apple prices are definitely up in the stores. Have you seen any of these profits trickle down to you?
We have not made any more. We have actually had a slight decrease in what we have received for our crops since 2021. There is those middlemen in the middle, though. So for me, unless you are a grower and have a packing facility, the way that we pick ours in the 20-bushel bins, that can't go. That's not ready to go to a grocery store. It's got
And I
to
understand that as well.
And so I know there's.
I will tell you that in my district, and you already have problems negotiating, I'm really concerned that Kroger and Albertsons are trying to merge. This means that prices will go up because there will be less competition. This will affect about half of the grocery stores in Washington State. So that is why I am calling on the FTC to block this. It will be the largest consolidation of supermarkets in U.S. history. It would be terrible for consumers with higher prices. It would be terrible for choice, and it would be even worse for the orchardists in my district, who will have zero leverage in terms of negotiating prices. So I want to call attention to corporate gouging. I want to call attention to this, that this does not help our orchardists, our other farmers, our dairymen, or other producers, that what it's doing is hurting us and not helping family farms.
And I feel like by you acknowledging that consolidation, imagine too, if farms aren't profitable and strong, we're going to see more consolidation with smaller farmers that can't stay in business. And then that just hurts future generations, that hurts the people's ability to have choice and diversity, because it takes all sizes and all types. So we don't want to see people having to sell out and be bought out by bigger farms. We want everyone to be profitable so they can stay in business.
We need to keep our family farms, and that's what I want to see in our Farm Bill. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize the chair of the Republican Policy Committee and a great member from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've heard my Democratic colleagues mention several times Project 2025, and I want to tell you, as chairman of the Republican Policy Committee, there's been no collaboration, no contribution. I haven't even read the report. So if you want to keep misleading the American public about it, I caution you that we produce our own policy committee policy. So just wanted to make that clarification for the record. I also want to point out some things that in 42 months, the Biden-Harris administration seasonally adjusted cumulative inflation for all goods and services has risen 19.4%. That's 2.5 times faster than the 48 months during the Trump administration. For a family with an average income, a median priced home has not been this unaffordable since 1982. In 237 cities across the country, the average starter home price is $1 million. The economic effects of current federal regulations are estimated at least $2.1 trillion annually. That's passed on to the consumers. That's almost equal to the entire amount of personal income taxes collected by the federal government. Right now, the Biden-Harris administration is on track to add $47,000 in net present value regulatory costs per household from rules finalized during its first term. The inflation-adjusted median income for all households under the Biden-Harris administration has dropped by 2.3%. Household debt is at a record $17.8 trillion, $3.5 trillion of that originated during the current Biden-Harris administration. A lot of this has to do with energy policy. And I heard my colleagues talk about higher energy costs. Natural gas prices are flat. In fact, they're down 4% since August, Mr. Chairman. Oil prices are at a near 3-year low, primarily because of the decline in the Chinese economy and because of concerns of a Biden-Harris inflicted recession. So what's keeping energy costs up? What's keeping household utility prices higher is the federal government, the Biden-Harris administration, forcing energy companies to shift to renewables and the added regulations that are being laid on top of people. Ms. Awanka, in your testimony, you mentioned the impacts of rising energy costs and household prices and how they impact poor working-class families. You even shared a story of people having to pick between paying rent, utilities, and feeding their kids. I just wanted to lay out these numbers for you. And Mr. Chairman, a picture's worth 1,000 words. The blue line is regulatory cost that gets passed on to people. The green column is personal income taxes. If you want to look at regulatory costs per household, the red line, it went down almost $11,000 under President Trump. It went up $47,000 under Biden-Harris. I think, that's a $58,000 differential right there. Would you like to comment on how this is impacting people in their daily lives, Ms. Awanka?
Thank you, sir. Absolutely. I think it's undermining the household financial situation. Not only are Americans still contending with high costs, groceries, energy, utilities, but they're also dealing with high borrowing costs because, interest rates are much higher, which means your credit card debt, your mortgage payments, your car notes are much more expensive. And so I think the American household is not as strong as it was at the start of 2021. Savings have been spent down. As we talked about, credit card debt is at a record high right now. And then when you look at low-income families, so many of these families, they bear a disproportionate burden of higher energy costs and higher grocery costs because they spend more of their discretionary income on it.
This is not just the poor and working class families, Mr. Chairman. This is also retirees. Since the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, retirement market assets, including annuities, defined benefit plans, defined contribution plans, IRAs, 401ks, things like that, adjusted for inflation, have actually gone down 6.6%. What we've gone through in the last 4 years is a tsunami of increased cost, inflation, that will continue over the next 4 years if these policies are perpetuated and carried forward. I think the American public needs to know how this is going to impact them. It's going to impact farmers too. Ms. Pryor would love to have had a discussion about that. I grew up on a farm in a small town in northwest Alabama, but I know what it's doing to them. And they want to eliminate hydrocarbon fuel. They want to eliminate natural gas. They won't say it now, but that's what they want to do. That's 80% of the cost of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. That's what feeds the world, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now go to Ms. Fletcher for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for taking the time to testify today. I agree with you, Chairman Duncan, with your opening statement that we still have important work to do here in this committee. Building the infrastructure to keep energy costs low for all Americans should be a priority for Congress, and there are some very real challenges in that regard for this committee to consider. I don't think this hearing is getting us there. It feels a little bit more like campaign season in here and a lot of political talking points. I don't think that's useful, but I do think we should devote serious time and consideration to moving permitting reform legislation and other serious policy. So I hope we will have the opportunity to do that in this Congress. As you know, my constituents in Houston have a lot to say about energy issues, and we have found common ground, Mr. Chairman, on a lot of issues. But what I worry about and what I see and hear over and over and over, including this hearing today, is the effort to politicize energy issues and make them about politics rather than policy. And that's incredibly dangerous. So I want to lay out a few facts to inform this discussion, but before I do that, I do want to note something that you said in your testimony today, Mrs. Onwuka, that you are representing women who value personal liberty, and I would note that I'm sure you would agree with me then, that when we're talking about the economic well-being of women in this country, access to reproductive health care and the ability for women to make their own decisions about whether, when, and how to have and grow their families is paramount, and that the policies in states like mine that they have put in place to restrict access to reproductive health care, to put the government between women and their doctors, and proposals to eliminate access to birth control are devastating for women on all the measures that you mentioned in your testimony: freedom, opportunity, and well-being. So, Mr. Chairman, I have a report from the Joint Economic Committee that I would like to submit for the record on this issue before I return to this subcommittee's focus on energy.
Without objections, order.
And then I want to take us back to a few energy issues and set out some important facts. At the end of 2019, the United States hit a new monthly peak for domestic crude oil production at just under 13 million barrels a day. More than 800 oil and gas rigs were up and operating and drilling here in the United States. When the pandemic hit, upstream oil and gas production collapsed under unprecedented demand destruction. At one point, WTI crude oil was trading at less than $0 a barrel. So comparing the price of gasoline during the height of the pandemic, when travel was at a standstill, to today, when we just had a record-breaking summer for vacation spending, is disingenuous. Under the Biden-Harris administration, crude production has again returned to record highs, more than 13 million barrels a day for the 2024 calendar year. And U.S. energy exports in 2023 were also the highest on record. Now, I heard you say earlier, Mr. Chairman, that this is a carryover from prior administrations, and it is true that the Obama administration lifted the crude oil export ban with this Congress, and other administrations conducted lease sales and other things that have led to the production that we're seeing today. But let's not forget where we were at the beginning of 2021 when the Biden-Harris administration began and where we are today, and focus on policies that can help us address the real issues facing Americans. Gas prices are currently averaging $3.29 a gallon and continue to move downward. They're facing downward pressures, and analysts think that it's going to go below $3 a gallon this fall. WTI crude prices hit a 3-year low yesterday, falling to $66 a barrel, as Mr. Palmer just mentioned. And when it comes to home energy prices, the Inflation Reduction Act is expected to save American families up to $38 billion on their electric bills in the next 6 years. The investments in the IRA will continue to build our energy economy and create new jobs across the country. It's expanding sources of energy, which is important, as we know in this committee that energy demand is continuing to grow. So there's a lot of data, there's a lot of information out there. I know that groups have found that there have been nearly $500 billion in new funding announced for clean energy funding over the period preceding the IRA. These investments are going to continue to lower energy prices in the coming years. But not everyone thinks we should continue these investments. And what we're seeing is that the Project 2025 calls for a future Trump administration, if it comes into being, to push for legislation to repeal dozens of credits and tax breaks for green energy companies in the Inflation Reduction Act. My constituents in Texas in the traditional energy space as well as in the innovation space are working with the IRA, not against it. And they are counting on the incentives in the IRA when they are making business decisions today. Across the board, they want reliable, durable policy to inform their decision-making about their investments for short and long-term strategies. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask Mr. Higgins for the record, and I will submit it in writing, to just talk about what a repeal of the IRA would mean, as Project 2025 proposes, and what that would mean for domestic energy investment in the United States. And since that took all my time, I will yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Julie yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Balderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Excuse me. Mr. Fisher, in your testimony, you referenced the concerning energy transition and PJM report from 2023, which I like to refer to as the 4 R's report. As you know, this report confirmed that at the same time, the region is seeing a historic increase in demand on the grid from electrification and data centers. We're forcing too much of our existing reliable generation offline through misguided state and federal policies. The 4 R's report was released well before the EPA finalized their Clean Power Plan 2.0, which only compounded the issues facing our grid. The results of the increasing demand and tightening supply were seen in PJM's recent capacity auction, in which we saw the total cost to consumers jump from just over $2 billion in the last auction to nearly $15 billion this summer. I know we've touched on the PJM auction earlier in this hearing, but I'd like to follow up, as this is one of my top priorities. Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, and QTS all have data center operations in the district that I represent. And I'm extremely grateful these companies are investing in Ohio. But we do need to pay attention to the increasing demand on the grid, and we need to analyze the negative impact EPA's power sector rules will have on our constituents. Mr. Fisher, as we begin to see the impacts of the Clean Power Plan 2.0 on generation and retirements, will retail electricity prices continue to increase?
Yeah, I think that's almost a given, and especially with the increased demand as we're seeing from new industrial load like the data centers that you're talking about, increasing demand while we're decreasing supply, it's a formula for skyrocketing prices.
Thank you. You've mentioned your concerns with the long-term impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, distorting prices in the market, and what that means for consumers. Right now, we're seeing a significant increase in renewable projects entering interconnection queues. At the end of last year, PJM's queued capacity by fuel type included 43,000 megawatts of wind energy, 148,000 megawatts of solar, and less than 6,000 megawatts of natural gas. But at the same time, approximately 38,000 megawatts of mostly renewable resources have already cleared PJM's interconnection queue, but not being built. Mr. Fisher, are you concerned by the lack of natural gas and nuclear projects entering the connection queues? And what does this mean for energy costs for our constituents in the future?
I am personally concerned, and it's not just me. The grid watchdog, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, has pointed out that the changing resource mix is now the top priority in terms of the top risk for reliability that they see.
Thank you. Looking toward the future, the EPA is actively working to further regulate the existing fleet of natural gas-fired plants under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. We're expecting the EPA to release this proposal in December. Mr. Fisher, if the EPA follows the same logic they used in the Clean Power Plan 2.0 for this upcoming rule covering existing gas combustion turbines, what will the impact be on the cost for our constituents?
Again, I hate to keep using the word skyrocket, but that's exactly what's going to happen. What they've done is they've mandated the impossible. They think it's possible to capture 90% of carbon emissions from power plants, from all of them, and that's just not possible. So what we're going to see is instead, if you're a power plant operator and you have the choice between doing the impossible and just shutting down, they're just going to shut down.
Agree. Thank you. I'm going to shift over to Ms. Pryor. Thank you for being here today and discussing the impacts of the inflation and higher energy prices under this administration. As a former farmer who operated my family farm for many years, I know firsthand how much misguided federal policies can impact our operations. Can you discuss how electrical vehicle mandates at the federal level, especially medium and heavy-duty EV mandates, may impact your operations and the entire supply chain that you rely on to ultimately get your products on shelves?
EV is just not practical for agriculture as a whole. It was mentioned earlier about the weight. How heavy the truck is limits what you can haul. And so when every bushel you can put on is going to then reduce the amount of diesel you're using, you're going to have a trade-out either, one way or the other. Being able to stop for a charge when you are hauling things that are sensitive to heat or cold or livestock that can't just sit and wait while you charge would be huge factors. I feel like it would make prices be even higher because it's going to cost more to take safeguards to protect those things while you're hauling them if they're having to sit and wait.
Agree. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, gentleman yields back. I now go to Ms. Castro from Florida for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for organizing this hearing because it really gives us an opportunity to contrast all of the hard work that Democrats have put in to lower costs for families, put money back into their pocketbooks, and contrast it with the looming far-right Project 2025 that would make life much more expensive for our neighbors. And I know we've been focused a lot on energy, but there was a report that came out just yesterday from the Treasury Department focused on healthcare cost. And because in the Energy and Commerce Committee over a decade ago, we hammered out the Affordable Care Act, that report said that over 50 million Americans have gone shopping in the healthcare marketplace to find an affordable healthcare plan over time. That's about 1 out of 7 Americans that have taken advantage, but this really hits home for me representing the state of Florida because about 1 out of every 3 Floridians have taken advantage of the Affordable Care Act. The entrepreneurs that don't have a health plan by a big employer, the folks who have fallen through the gaps, that over 6.7 million Floridians just over the past 10 years have gone shopping and found an affordable plan. That That reflects the fact that more people in America have health coverage today than ever before. That's something we can be proud of. They have peace of mind that if they're diagnosed with something serious or something minor, they're not going to be destitute in their lifetimes. And it really contrasts with the proposal for Project 2025 that proposes to roll back a lot of those consumer protections, everything that we did to prohibit discrimination for pre-existing conditions, everything to ensure that kids can stay on their parents' plans till age 26. And then the Inflation Reduction Act helped make those plans less expensive for families. Because of our work through the Inflation Reduction Act, people are saving about $800 per year on their health coverage. And we're not going to go back. We're not going to allow folks to bring this devious Project 2025 and make life more expensive for them. It's been the IRA that has capped the price of insulin at $35 per month for our neighbors on Medicare. Finally, Medicare has the ability to negotiate drug prices, something that we have focused on for years and something that, I don't care if you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, you've been crying out for relief on high drug costs. And now through the Biden-Harris administration, they have negotiated lower prices. The price cap for our neighbors on Medicare at $2,000 for drug prices is coming into effect shortly. These are real savings and real money back into the pockets of our neighbors, and we're not going to let some hidden, devious plan, Project 2025, make life more expensive. We're just not. We're going to stand up to the powerful special interest and fight for our neighbors back home. It's also been the Inflation Reduction Act that has made electric bills more affordable. Coming from the state of Florida, the Tampa Bay Times and the FSU Center for Economic Forecasting did an analysis to answer the question, what's driven higher cost hikes in Florida on electric bills? We used to be 13th in the nation, now the 4th highest cost, and they determine it's the over-reliance on gas. You would think in Florida, the Sunshine State, we would power our lives through the free and abundant energy of the sun. 75% of our electricity generation comes from gas because the electric utilities have a sweetheart deal on all of this. But thankfully, the Inflation Reduction Act has pushed back on a lot of those special interests. Another report that just came out said that thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, more than 165,000 Floridians claimed the residential clean energy tax credit this year, saving $715 million on their electric bills through a tax cut. Plus, more than 154,000 Floridians claimed the energy efficiency home improvement credit for up to $3,200 for installing more energy efficient windows, insulation, heat pumps, and they have saved over $131 million. But beware, because Project 2025 proposes to roll back those savings, really rip the carpet out from under our neighbors. We're not going to let it happen. People need these savings. They need these monies. We have to reduce pollution. I really appreciate you all calling this hearing so that we can point out the contrast between what Democrats have done to lower bills and lower costs and what Project 2025 would do to their pocketbooks. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair will now go to Mr. Pfluger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Higgins, are you accusing Scott Sheffield of collusion with OPEC?
No, sir.
Your statement earlier made it seem like that.
I was trying to respond to the question about the FTC.
Have you accused Scott Sheffield of collusion with OPEC?
I have not.
It sounded like that's what your statement was earlier.
No, I was...
When we talk about weaponization of a government agency, this is it. This is it. The FTC, based on Biden's campaign promise in 2019 to end fossil fuels, coming after a private citizen and not allowing the due process to actually occur, this is the weaponization that we're talking about right here. Lots of questions being asked about his communications, but no opportunity to actually answer them. When we talk about the exchanges of text messages with OPEC that are all publicly available, I think we need to get to the facts here. Do you support due process for Scott Sheffield?
No, I support the FTC's process.
Do you support due process as an American?
Sure,
Okay, so you support him having due process.
sure.
So you would ask Lena Khan to have due process.
I haven't spoken to the FTC.
Okay, maybe you should. We're talking about attacking Mr. Sheffield for certain statements. The FTC ignores Mr. Sheffield's role in expanding U.S. production over the past couple of decades. The shale revolution has actually expanded. My Democrat colleagues have pointed out rightfully that we are producing more. Are you pro-fracking, Mr. Higgins? Do you believe in fracking?
I believe it exists.
Do you believe in it? Are you a advocate of fracking?
I do not advocate for more fracking.
So you disagree with Kamala Harris?
Pardon?
You disagree with Vice President Harris, who has said now she's pro-fracking.
I think Vice President Harris said that the Inflation Reduction Act's investments in clean energy.
Do you
mean that
believe
the
in
question
fracking?
to
Do you
ban
believe
fracking
in-
is no longer relevant?
No, that's not what she said. She's very clearly flip-flopped on her position in the last month or so. She has said she is now pro-fracking. Do you believe she's pro-fracking?
I can't make political statements, sir.
You can, I mean, you're here as a witness. I'm asking you a question. Do you believe she supports fracking?
I would refer to her statements last night at the debate.
Do you support fracking?
I do not advocate for expanded fracking.
So you disagree with her statements last night?
I can't make political statements, sir.
But you can make a judgment on whether or not you agree with her or not.
I agree with the statement that the Inflation Reduction Act has made the...
Are you paying more for household goods today than you did in 2021?
In 2021, you mean
No, as just
during COVID?
gas, groceries, just normal stuff.
Right, so like during COVID, you know, maybe around the time right before Russia invaded Ukraine, I think those were tough times. And prices are
Mr.
higher
Higgins,
today.
are you paying more today than you were in 2021?
Yes, prices are higher today
Okay,
in
thank you.
2021.
The Bureau of Labor has come out with statistics, and on average, Americans are paying $1,095 more per month than they did in January of 2021. This is from the federal government today. Do you believe in that statement?
Sure.
Okay, very good. Households are paying an estimated $148 more per food, $260 more per shelter, $129 more per month on energy on average. It's about $30,000 more a year. Do you believe in that?
I do. Also, wages are higher, employment is higher.
Do you believe that we are paying more now than we were in 2021? Do you believe that inflation is higher and has led to a $30,000 increase per year annually for goods?
Prices are higher, but inflation's down to 2.5% as of this morning.
So inflation is 2.5% for the last 4 years?
No, I'm saying prices are higher now than they were then, but the rate of inflation today is down to 2.5%, which is more than three quarters lower than.
Thank you very much. The weaponization from this administration on the energy industry that underpins our economy is nothing short of absolutely tragic. Hundreds of thousands of American jobs, the absolute necessity for every Main Street business, for every household, for our military, for national security purposes. And to hear that, and I'm glad you actually said you were not for fracking, that we now have to ask questions of the Vice President to see where her position is. Thank you for actually stating the obvious. I was going to ask you to write an op-ed with me, a pro-fracking op-ed, but we know where you stand. I think the question in our minds is, we don't know where Vice President Harris stands on this because we're pretty sure that she's against fracking. We're pretty sure she's against American energy. We're pretty sure that the administration in the last 4 years has done everything they can to put a target on the industry that actually underpins our economy and reduces prices of everything. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now go to Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Duncan, and also Ranking Member DeGette for holding this hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here, sharing your opinions, and in some cases, your expertise on the facts. Mr. Chairman, I've submitted a copy to the committee of this document that I'd like to submit for the record, and it's directly from the Heritage Foundation website. And
Objection, so ordered.
Thank you. It's titled, Trump Administration Embraces Heritage Foundation Policy Recommendations. not prospectively, but this is dated from their website on January 23rd, 2018, in the middle of Trump's presidency. Unfortunately, the rhetoric we've heard today from Republicans blaming the Biden-Harris administration for rising costs has been rife with misinformation for their own political gain. The truth of the matter is that Republicans are not serious about protecting everyday Americans. In fact, their current proposed policies and future policy plans sell out the very people they are sworn to protect. To understand this, we must look not further than the very policy playbook created for a Trump potential presidency, Project 2025. Among many listed proposals included in Project 2025, the 900-page plan calls for to consolidate power into the presidency, place the Justice Department squarely under Donald Trump's authority, gut civil service, and abolish many critical government agencies like the Department of Education. None of this sounds like protecting the American people because it isn't. What it does sound like, however, is how a party plans to dismantle democracy. Unsurprisingly, Project 2025 does nothing to address the climate crisis and lowering its associated root causes. Absent of any pollution reduction goals, Project 2025 sets out to gut the regulatory bodies that protect our air and water quality, eliminate longstanding programs that support clean energy, and radically expand oil and gas drilling. And unfortunately, Republicans here in Congress have already been hard at work to pave the way for this very agenda. They have, for example, tried to pass legislation that would allow unlimited exports of liquefied natural gas, gut energy efficiency standards for appliances, and repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. If successful, their efforts will dramatically worsen the climate crisis, which, let's be clear, has already proven to be very deadly. But since Republicans would like to talk about costs, let's talk about how their plans will impact costs for everyday Americans. Mr. Higgins, you mentioned in your testimony that the Project 2025 agenda would, quote, lock the United States into continued greenhouse gas emissions of more than 4.7 gigatons every year from now through 2050 and beyond, end quote. Can you describe the near and long-term public health costs that we would expect to be associated with emissions at that scale?
For the United States to continue emitting greenhouse gases at that rate, it would make it impossible for the world to reach net zero emissions like we need to do by mid-century. And failing to stabilize global temperatures at 1.5 degrees would lead to very significant, very near-term impacts. Wildfire risk, the exposure to wildfire pollution as a result, extreme heat, which can be deadly, and the list goes on. We're already seeing the effects today at less than 1.5 degrees, and continuing to emit at that rate would be disastrous.
And extreme weather patterns, both wet and dry, right? Like we've not seen in God knows how long.
That's right, both droughts and extreme flooding.
Okay, thank you. The scientific community agrees that the climate crisis is accelerating and climate disasters across our nation, and there are undoubtedly costs associated with those disasters, both not only to the economy, but everyday lives of Americans. Can you describe how growing disaster risk will impact costs for Americans, particularly if the climate crisis goes unchecked?
So costs are one of the, extreme weather is one of the primary drivers of costs. In 2023, last year, global droughts across multiple different countries at the same time as Russia's attacking the grain supplies in Ukraine contributed to the high energy or the high food prices globally. You also see the disasters, which happen to have a disproportionately rough impact on low-income households, including households that are in floodplains. And that is passed on more broadly through insurance rates. And all of these costs are extreme for households.
You mentioned, and I quote, fighting climate change fights inflation. Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, so if we can stabilize global temperatures at 1.5 degrees, not only does that mean we have invested in cleaner energy forms and improved energy efficiency, it means that we're avoiding the worst of the extreme weather yet to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My time having expired, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back, and I'll go to the gentleman from acting as ranking member, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Our Republican colleagues keep suggesting that moving forcefully and deliberately towards a clean energy future is raising costs for consumers all over the place. But in fact, the failure to embrace that transition, that clean energy transition, can lead to higher energy prices. A PJM capacity auction in the Mid-Atlantic a few weeks ago demonstrated this. PJM's lack of transmission upgrade planning has forced the continued operation of a coal-fired power plant in Maryland that is going to mean higher prices for Maryland ratepayers. So the fact is that more clean energy production, better planning, integrating that new clean energy is the best path forward for the climate, frankly, for the energy industry, and certainly for consumers out there. Mr. Higgins, could you talk about the importance of the Biden administration's efforts to make it easier for sources of clean energy to connect to the grid, as well as accelerate build-out of transmission infrastructure? How will FERC's recent rules on interconnection and on regional transmission planning, order numbers 2023 and 1920, which you're very familiar with, help bring affordable clean energy to Maryland and across the country?
The grid is going through a remarkable transformation right now as a demand for electricity is growing due to things like data centers and all of the new battery manufacturing facilities that have been spurred by IRA. We're in the middle of a manufacturing renaissance. And the Inflation Reduction Act is solving for the economics of adding new clean electricity. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is trying now to solve for the challenge of getting all those new resources connected to the grid at the times we need them, in the places we need them, including through transmission lines to connect between where the resources are strong and where the demand is needed. All of this is going to be really important to be able to meet that rising demand. But the retail implications are significant if we can't manage to do both. And that's why being able to match investments with standard setting and a firm regulatory commission is so important.
Appreciate that. Under the Biden-Harris administration's goal, 80% of the U.S. energy capacity will come from renewables by 2030. Also by 2030, American families are anticipated to save up to $38 billion on their electricity bills, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, which you just mentioned. So clean energy goes hand in hand with savings, yet for some reason, our Republican colleagues are trying to sabotage this effort. Mr. Higgins, can you talk about how efforts to dismantle these tax credits and these clean energy technology incentives that were in the Inflation Reduction Act, and which lower bills and foster a low-carbon domestic power sector, threaten our ability to meet our clean energy goals? I mean, these things are really producing the change we want to see, moving us in a steady way towards that clean energy future. What do we risk and what will American families lose if attempts to roll back these incentives, these credits, and so forth are successful?
Under current policy, between the standards and the incentives and the new rules that we talked about just a minute ago from FERC, we're looking at increasing the amount of wind and solar additions to the grid from about 20 gigawatts per year, which was the average over the last 5 years, to 200 gigawatts a year in the 2030s. We're talking about a massive new construction effort with enormously beneficial impacts on the electricity grid because these sources are going to be so much cheaper. If we yank those tax credits away in the middle of that effort, or even worse, cut the manufacturing investments that are making it possible for that to be done here in America, we're going to leave ourselves exposed, less competitive in the global market, and we're going to see higher electricity rates as a result than we would otherwise.
It'd be crazy to do it because you have industries now all shifting and moving structurally in a major way in this new direction, and pull the rug out from under them would really work against our interests as a nation. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. I now go to Dr. Joyce for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan and Ranking Member DeGette, for allowing me to waive on to today's hearing. And thanks for the witnesses for appearing with us today. The main takeaway from this hearing should be simple and actually something that every elementary student in my district knows, and that is that decisions have consequences. Over the last 3.5 years, the Biden-Harris administration has made policy decisions that have attacked the American energy industry. And now, my constituents are seeing those consequences each and every day at the pump, at the grocery store, and in their utility bills. The most recent capacity auction for PJM in July hit a record high of $14.7 billion. That's more than $2 billion that the ratepayers, my constituents, will have to pay. As a Pennsylvanian, and as we heard last night, every 4 years, national figures come to the Commonwealth and flip-flop their position on fracking. And finally, accept that it is giving our nation clean, reliable, and affordable energy. In the communities that I proudly represent, we already know those benefits, and we don't change our minds every 4 years. As I traveled throughout my district in August, there was clear frustration with these higher prices because people know that by unleashing the energy that's under the feet of my constituents, inflation should be cut in half and energy prices could be stabilized. We heard this from business leaders like the CEO of EQT, Toby Rice, when he said, "I've been hearing the administration tout the fact that we are producing record numbers of energy, yet still, energy costs are up 30%. We need to be doing more, and we can be doing more to unleash American energy. It is within our power to reclaim not only American energy independence, but American energy dominance. In 2023, the U.S. produced 36% more crude oil than Saudi Arabia, despite the obstacles put in place by the Biden-Harris administration. With new interstate pipelines, Pennsylvania could produce the natural gas needed to provide power to the entire East Coast. With common sense policies, we can have clean, reliable, affordable domestic energy sources to unlock economic growth and release pressure that has put inflation on American families, on American farmers, and American growers. Ms. Pryor, I'm honored to have apple grower testify in front of our committee today. My district in Pennsylvania is blessed with large amounts of peaches and apples from the orchards, and I was able to walk through some of these orchards just a few weeks ago. You as a farmer, you as an apple grower specifically, how do these high energy costs affect your operations?
Petroleum products in particular influence so many things, prices of other things, fertilizer, packaging, and actual fuel. So it's not just affecting the fuel that we use, the physical fuel that we use, the gas and diesel, it's the other products, the letter that the other gentleman was talking about from his constituent saying that doubled, that's very accurate. Our fertilizer prices have doubled, and that's a huge expense to start with. So when they are increased even more, it makes a big difference.
Does it affect your bottom line?
Absolutely, yes.
Has it affected your bottom line this year?
Yes.
Mr. Fisher, as I mentioned earlier, the last PJM capacity auction hit a record high of $14.7 billion. Why has it become so expensive to keep baseload generating capacity online? And how has this administration's policies, particularly the EPA rules, affect the market?
The EPA power plant rules are directly responsible for shutting down a significant amount of supply. So we're taking supply off. As you know, the PJM region is growing. There are a lot of data centers there, new manufacturing, et cetera. So we have a very predictable outcome from reduced supply and increased demand, which is skyrocketing prices.
So, Mr. Fisher, if this trajectory of record high prices for capacity continues, how will that affect my constituents who are ratepayers within the PJM interconnection?
So as I noted, I'm a resident of the state of Maryland. The Maryland Consumer Council has estimated that retail costs could go up by 24%. I don't know if that's true for every state, but it is a significant cost that will certainly filter down to retail rates.
Ms. Okwaka, 119,000 families in my district make less than $55,000 a year. Can you please explain why working-class Americans, those who can least afford it, disproportionately suffer when energy costs increase?
Thank you. Low-income families spend disproportionately more of their disposable income on gas, on groceries, on those essential items. And so when gas prices rise, when energy prices rise, they're going to be spending more money. And we see that low-income families tend to be the ones who suffer from energy hurdles, whether it's heating or cooling their homes, as well as just being able to get to and from work.
Let me conclude with, we can decrease that suffering on middle-class families by unleashing the power that lives and resides and is capable of being extracted underneath the feet of my constituents in Pennsylvania. Thank you again for allowing me to wave on, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Chairman yields back. That concludes the hearing. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Members may have additional written questions for you all. I'll remind members they'll have 10 business days to submit those questions for the record. And I ask the witnesses to do their best to submit responses within 10 business days from receipt of the questions. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that'll be the order. And again, thank you all for being here.